We'll call this meeting of the JEA Board to order. I'd like to ask everyone to rise for a moment of reflection, followed by the pledge to the flag. Thank you. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated. We've had an agenda published and circulated. It's got one correction. It incorrectly states the next Finance and Audit Committee meeting is in March of 2019. It's actually Monday, December 3rd. So next Monday is the Finance and Audit Committee meeting. With that correction, I'd like to ask for a motion for approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Thank you, Reverend Newbill. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. So all in favor for adoption of the agenda, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Passes unanimously. I'd like to ask Mr. Zahn to stand up and give us a safety briefing. It's a core value here at JEA.
Sure. Safety is a core value at JEA. In the event of emergency, somebody call 911. CPR. In the event, please identify the person to your right and proceed in an orderly fashion down the stairs to the left of the elevator, across the street, the southwest corner of the street. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Zahn. Chief Legal Officer Jody Brooks for our Sunshine Law and Public Records statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a duly noticed public meeting in which minutes will be taken, and there is quorum present in the room, and we're in proper order to proceed.
Thank you very much. I recognize Dave Bruderly for public comment. Mr. Bruderly.
How come I'm always first?
You're the only one today, Dave.
Really? My goodness. Well, I'm responding to the article in the Times Union this morning, the front-page article where it was said handwriting is on the wall, and I want this with respect to the vetting and the process. I'd like to share my perspective on why the fellow from California withdrew, I guess. And I think part of the handwriting on the wall that may have motivated the Sacramento executive to withdraw was the fact that California is very different from Florida from a political standpoint, from a policy framework with respect to the development, research, development, demonstration of clean energy. And I make this statement based on my 50 years of experience in the business and the fact that I've spent a huge amount of time trying to bring California type of policies to this state and would not be here today if California had not been beyond the bleeding edge in the promotion of the research, development, and demonstration of clean energy technologies. So with that said, you need to choose a CEO who can navigate some very difficult political headwinds and has a demonstrated capability to do that, to help transition JEA into this 21st century utility I've talked about, and also to help the city of Jacksonville figure out how to bring this community in line with the goals of the international community in reducing greenhouse gas pollution. Just today, the GAP report came out from the IPCC that basically said we have to do more. We have to have 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the near term, midterm, next 20 years, if we're going to try to avoid the kind of catastrophic scenarios that have been put out by the scientific community. And to do that, JEA needs to provide leadership to help the city put together a program that will make this a zero net carbon emission community. That is technically feasible. What it requires is a political will to do that. And that means that your leader must be prepared to lead by example. And in the absence today of any documented federal or state support, policy support or funding support that would help JEA do that. So we've got to figure out how to do this on our own within a very confusing policy framework at the federal and state level and navigate those very difficult waters without running aground. My opinion, JEA is in very good hands with respect to day-to-day operations with your management team. I expect that to continue. And the CEO who you hire should be able to work with you as a board to figure out how do we put that policy framework together to create the jobs in a clean energy economy and energy efficiency economy and an employment kind of opportunities for all the people in this community, not just the rich people on the beach, but the poor people who live in the floodplain, all of us. And I stand ready to continue my engagement on this issue with you and work as a semi-retired, self-unemployed ex-consultant who's not afraid to stick his foot in his mouth from time to time and ask for you to achieve the impossible, and work and basically make your decision based on a demonstrated recent record of performance and get beyond the politics and the nonpartisan, keep this as a nonpartisan process based on fact and scientific interpretation of fact. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Always appreciate your being an engaged and informed consumer and your always insightful comments. Recognize Dane Gray. Public comment. Mr. Gray, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Can you give your address, please, for the record?
3815 Reed Pond Drive North, Jacksonville, Florida, 32223.
Thank you, Mr. Gray.
I just wanted to take 1 minute to address or to give you some personal feedback on your selection for the CEO process. I do believe that you guys are in a critical moment. As all of you well aware, that it's important that the CEO have a vision for the future, something that's going to take us into the next millennium. I think that your current interim CEO has been phenomenal in giving us a direction, giving us new hope, new energy, and new vigor, and I would love to see that continue for our city. I would love to see how things move. I know that there's been recent articles about the day-to-day, and I think any CEO, no matter the organization, doesn't know everything about every single thing in every area of his company, but if he hires the right people and put them around him, he can be phenomenal. And I think with the guidance of your guys as a board and with the vision of Mr. Zahn, we can do great things here in the city. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. Appreciate your comments. Next, recognize our council liaison, Councilman Schellenberg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to thank not only the board members on the select committee, but also going forward, the board is making a decision for Jacksonville for not only today, but in the future. And I wanted to thank all the applicants that applied through the search committee. And I know how difficult it is, and I just thank you for all the time and effort you put into the getting down to where we are right now. And I pray that we do the right thing, what's beneficial to not only to the organization, but to the taxpayers of Jacksonville. And that includes some people in St. Johns County and Nassau County. So thank you very much, Chair, for allowing me to say a few words.
Thank you, Councilman Schellenberg. Next up on the agenda is the consent agenda. May I have a motion to adopt and approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Cumber. Is there a second? Mr. Campion, thank you. All in favor of adoption of the consent agenda, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Passes unanimously. Okay. On to the real meat of the matter, if it were, as it were. We've got the minutes of the search committee included with your package. May I have a motion to approve the minutes of the search committee as presented?
So moved.
Take that as a motion from Reverend Newbill, second from Ms. Green. Any questions or corrections to the minutes? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Passes unanimously. And now I'd like to just briefly review the process that we'll follow for today's meeting. Prior to the meeting, Ms. Brooks, our Chief Legal Officer, met with the three candidates and drew lots to determine the order in which they would present to the board. The order is Chris Euchster, Pamela Hill, and Aaron Zahn. Each candidate will have 30 minutes with the board seated at the table here, 5 minutes for an introductory presentation, and then follow that with 25 minutes for a question and answer session. After each candidate presentation, question and answer session, the board members will have an opportunity to engage in the preliminary scoring of that candidate using a scoring guide that has been furnished to each board member. Then after all of the candidates have presented, they'll be invited to be excused to a secure location to facilitate board discussion of the candidates, to be followed by final scoring of the three candidates by the board. Upon completion of the final scoring, we'll pass our score sheets identified by board member to Ms. Brooks. She and Ms. Furman from Hydrick and Struggles will then tabulate the scores. Once all the scores have been tabulated, Ms. Brooks will read each of the board members' individual scores and final combined score for each candidate. Upon the conclusion of the reading of the scores, I will entertain a motion to ratify the scores and approve the candidate with the highest combined score as the JEA Managing Director and CEO. Upon presentation, passage, discussion, and passage of that motion, the candidate will be handed off to OGC and the board for negotiation of an employment contract. So that's the process we'll go through today. Before we begin with the candidate interviews, I want to take a moment to comment on some of the stories that have been kicked about regarding the search process. I will say that the search committee and the board of JEA have engaged in a thorough, transparent, open, and deliberate process over the last 7 months. A complete timeline of our CEO search is included with the board agenda and publicly available to all members of the press and anyone else. Any suggestion that there is a predetermined outcome is disrespectful to this board and its members who have devoted countless hours to this process. It is disrespectful to the candidates who have interviewed in good faith, and it's disrespectful to Mr. Zahn to suggest that he could not be selected on the basis of his own qualifications. So I categorically reject that there is any predetermined outcome to this process. I reject the suggestion that there's been any interference or influence by the mayor or his administration. These board members have acted in good faith and in good conscience to make a decision based on their own individual interviews and interactions with these candidates. The members of the search committee have met with each candidate twice. Every other member of the board has met with them in person at least once. We're going to meet with them again today. In the history of the independent authorities, I believe JEA's search process today has been as thorough, open, and transparent as any other. So I wanted to take a minute to respond to those suggestions to the contrary. Regarding Mr. McDermott and his withdrawal this past week, when he first informed Ms. Furman, she immediately called me, and I immediately called Mr. McDermott. I spoke to him before he issued his press release or responded to any members of the media regarding his withdrawal. Mr. McDermott personally assured me on the telephone that the sole reason for the withdrawal of his candidacy at JEA was after further deliberations with his family. He had had initial deliberations. They had come to a preliminary conclusion that he'd be comfortable moving to Jacksonville away from his 3 children and grandchildren. But after he became a finalist, he had a further conversation with his family, family meeting as he represented to me, and they concluded that they would not be comfortable moving. And that was the sole reason that Mr. McDermott gave for withdrawing his name from the candidacy here, and I take Mr. McDermott at his word. Finally, with regard to the issue of background checks, I think we sometimes use that word a bit loosely. As I've been educated by Ms. Furman from Hydrick and Struggles, background checks colloquially will refer to a criminal or financial check. It's something that JE does for all new employees at the senior executive level. What we really want to do with our candidates is engage in reputational reference checks. The sentiment expressed at the search committee in its very first meeting with Ms. Furman was that we have some reputational reference check. I specifically stated to her, I do not want to have JEA facing a Me Too moment 6 months after hiring a new CEO. And therefore, I wanted to make sure that they engaged in the kind of thorough reputational 360 reference check necessary to vet any issues with the candidates, talking to peers, subordinates, and superiors. The background check is done internally at JEA. But over the last several weeks, since the determination of the finalists, Hydrick and Struggles, consistent with the scope of services in their contract, has conducted a reputational reference check, speaking to peers, subordinates, and superiors of the finalists. Ms. Furman will give her report verbally to the board today. So I hope that answers any questions that have been raised regarding background checks of the candidates. With that introduction, I'll invite Chris Euchster to please join us at the table and give a brief introduction of himself and his qualifications for the public. Again, members of the board have already had an opportunity to meet and get to know Chris, but you have not. So this session will allow you, the public, to hear, in their own words, the candidate's history and qualifications, and then questions that we as board members will put to them. So with that, Chris, welcome.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you, Chair Howard. I want to, first of all, say thank you to the board for the time and interest in my candidacy for the CEO search here. I've gotten to know Jacksonville a little bit, and it seems like a pretty special community and an exciting opportunity. I'm currently the Chief Operating Officer for CPS Energy. We are the largest municipally owned gas and electric utility in the country. There are a lot of parallels with JEA. We're vertically integrated. We have coal, nuclear, gas, renewables in our mix. We have transmission distribution lines, and we serve the retail customer in the greater San Antonio region. And we also have the parallels, as we talked about in our interview, that this industry is changing dramatically. And if we don't embrace that change and do things, we may no longer be relevant over the long run. So we have done quite a bit in San Antonio. 10 years ago, we were primarily focused on coal and nuclear. 80% of the power coming to San Antonio was coal and nuclear. And since then, we are now a leader in solar. We're a leader in wind, energy efficiency, demand response. We're bringing new products and services to our customers. So we have transformed our utility and our community in a way that I think there are a lot of parallels here in San Antonio, in Jacksonville with JEA. I would like to talk about kind of 5 things I would like to accomplish as a CEO if it plays that way. I think the first thing is operational excellence. I mean, those are table stakes. It all starts with running a utility well. Our customers entrust their resources, their hard-earned dollars to us to provide services to them. We need to be as efficient and as effective in providing those services back to our community. So my leadership style, I'm fairly competitive. I want to be the best utility in the country, bottom line. And so I want to make sure that we are hitting all our metrics from reliability, safety, customer satisfaction, employee engagement, environment. I want to be shooting for top decile, top quartile in terms of performance. And JEA's got a lot to work with. It's a very well-run utility, and I want to see that continue, and I want to even take it up to that next level. So that's the first part, is just you gotta run a utility well to do any of these bigger things that you're trying to do. The second thing I'd like to accomplish as a CEO of JEA is the whole transformation in the customer experience. Expectations are changing quite a bit. These days a thought comes in your mind, and all of a sudden an hour later a box shows up at your doorstep. Obviously you do a few things with Amazon along the way, but the world is changing, and we have to benchmark ourselves against other companies, not just the utility sector. We got to benchmark ourselves against the web, the Amazons of the world, the ride shares, the Ubers, the Lyfts. It's just a completely different world, and we got to move away from basically providing a commodity service, a cost-based commodity service of kilowatt hours, plugging your appliance into the wall, into something that's more value-based to the community, value-based services for our community and our customers. And we've done that at CPS Energy. We've got a number of different innovative programs, Solar Host, where we basically develop solar systems on customer rooftops at no cost to those customers, and basically they get an income stream for the use of their roof. The community gets back the power. It's a win-win for everyone. We've done community solar projects where people can buy solar panels and basically get a credit on their bill. We've got EV programs. We have a resiliency service that we're standing up, where basically if a storm comes through or a car hits a pole, that customer can still have power by putting generation on site. And we're thinking about it from both a natural gas perspective, where there are underground infrastructure, to microgrids and energy storage that can provide that same service. So we just have to move away from that commodity mentality and more to value. How do we deliver value to our community and our customers? The third accomplishment that I would look to do is, a lot of it is moving beyond fossil fuels on your generation mix. Solar costs, wind costs, renewables have come down dramatically over the years. And so there's real opportunities to kind of reduce your emission, reduce your carbon footprint by moving beyond fossil fuels. Now, obviously there are some challenges in terms of being able to dispatch when the load is required, so energy storage is kind of the holy grail there. But you can do a lot from a portfolio standpoint by marrying solar with demand response or energy efficiency, putting pieces together to get you more, kind of a 1 + 1 = 3 versus just 2. So there's some real opportunity to kind of really clean up the generation mix. And we've done that. We've done that in a big way at CPS Energy, and we continue to do that with our flexible path that we've put in front of our community. The fourth one is electrification. I know that JEA is all over this. So basically, how do we electrify additional applications that are happening in our community? Obviously, we power homes and businesses, but there's opportunities to power the ports with electricity. In industries, instead of have cogeneration there, you can power it with electricity coming from the utility. EVs, electric vehicles. So there's a lot of new applications that if you move beyond fossil, not only do you have a revenue boost for the utility and a kind of a more viable model over the long run, but you actually help the city and the community get to a net zero carbon emission that one of the public members stated earlier, that the utility can take a leadership role and create economic growth and economic vitality, and also be able to really have a clean energy environment for the city of Jacksonville. And then the fifth thing is really to do this with the community. I think one of the special things about public power is you really care a lot about the community, and there is a long-term play. It's not a quarterly profit issue. It's a long-term play that you're looking out for the welfare and the benefit of the community, and you're trying to bring everyone along. You're trying to be inclusive with everyone in this journey of transformation. And there's opportunity to educate, there's opportunity to empower, it's opportunities of jobs in terms of some of the things that you can accomplish in this journey that we're moving forward on. So I think the community aspect is really important to it, and to me, I would define community very broadly, not just our customers out there, but our employees, our stakeholders. There's a rich group a diverse group of stakeholders that we need to make sure we're connected with and we're incorporating in this journey of transformation. So with that, those are my big five, so to speak, and I just wanted to share with you a little bit of a vision I would have if this moves forward.
Thank you very much, Chris. We'll now turn to individual members of the board for questions, and I'll just start with Ms. Flanagan. Sorry, I should have given you a heads up. We're going to start with you. But I'll rotate through, so the next questions will come from next people.
Chris, thank you for your time today and your application. It's been a pleasure to get to know you through the process. We've had a lot of discussion about your subject matter expertise in power and energy. I'm curious if you can speak more broadly to your experience with financial oversight and management of P&L responsibilities.
So, we work very closely with our finance department in terms of, trips to the rating agency. In fact, I'm supposed to be going to a rating agency trip here in several weeks with the CPS Energy finance team and one of our board members. So we are close collaborators with our finance department on making sure that the operations and the finance are closely aligned, so that we do things that are cost effective, cost efficient, and create value for our community. So I think my experience over the years has been really that partnership with the finance group. I do have some finance on the education side. When I did my PhD in engineering, I did a finance minor. I took a few courses at the MIT Sloan School there. So academically, theoretically, I understand the financial topics, like accounting and strategy and marketing. But I would be looking to partner with our finance group and the board in terms of, that path.
Anything else, Ms. Flanagan? Mr. Cumber?
Chris, good to see you again.
Likewise.
We talked a little bit about this in the two times I met face-to-face, but I think it's important, if it didn't come up with others on the board and for the public to kind of hear a little bit about your experience dealing with a similar issue that we are with Plant Vogtle, your role in that nuclear asset. And then I'd love to get your assessment of JEA's current posture with Plant Vogtle and any thoughts you would have around that.
Yeah, that's a tough question. There are parallels. We are owners of the South Texas project in partnership with NRG and Austin Energy. We have a 40% stake in it. a while, maybe 10-plus years ago, we looked to expand that site, to put 2 additional reactors there. It has the capacity to add 2 reactors there. We did it as a 50-50 venture with NRG. Austin Energy decided to kind of stay out of that. This was prior to me joining CPS Energy. This is kind of the early 2000s. And at some point, some of the similar issues that played out here, the cost kept escalating. There was an unknown about ultimately how much this would cost. And our community said, we don't want to do this. Slightly different, situations in terms of ownership stake. We were 50-50 partners with NRG. We did litigate. We put a pretty big number out there. We litigated first. We filed in Bexar County. I think we sued them for $32 billion. And that made sort of top of the fold press early on. But in addition to the litigation path, there also has to be sort of a dialogue with the other parties, because ultimately you have to figure out a resolution to this. Ultimately, I don't think the courts can decide it. That's a very lengthy process. And I do think that there are ways of resolving this through kind of good business terms. And, obviously I would need to read the contract and come up to speed on the issues there. But I think the biggest thing for us when we resolved our issue is we basically said, look, we will be open to any ownership stake, but we're not going to put another dime into the expansion. And so what we settled on was we went from 50% share of whatever got built to 7.625% share. And for that, we did not put another dime into it. And we were willing to, negotiate up and down on that, but the biggest thing was we were not going to put another dime into the project. So ultimately, we got to a resolution there. That project did not happen, and we ultimately wrote off our investment, and that was a write-up of roughly about $400 million, and so we're completely out of that project.
Great, thank you. And I have one follow-up.
Yeah,
if we have
please.
time. I know when you came here for the second face-to-face interview, you came with your spouse and spent a lot of time looking at Jacksonville. Jacksonville's got a very interesting history with consolidation. One of the 5 things that you mentioned that kind of struck me is just JEA being a community asset. And maybe a little bit of an unfair question because it's been a short visits to Jacksonville, but just in your time here, in your research on JEA, and looking at JEA as a community asset, any thoughts on how JEA's assets could be leveraged for the benefit of this community moving forward from an economic development standpoint, from any other kind of perspective?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think JEA can play a pivotal role in terms of the economic development of the city. Obviously, we want to be partners on new deals that come to the city. But one of the things we did in San Antonio, we created a new energy economy. So all of these new energy, clean energy deals that we did, we had a requirement that those companies actually had to move to San Antonio, or they had to stand up jobs. And we have over 1,000 jobs that are associated with that. So as JEA goes through this transformation, I think there's huge opportunity to create jobs here locally. Educate, empower folks, and I think some of the conversations we had really bring the entire community together into this, not just a subset of it. And those jobs could be rooftop solar installers. It could be home energy management consultants. They could be manufacturers. There's just a plethora of different opportunities as you start to create new markets and new opportunities in this path forward. So I do believe JEA can play a critical role in that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Euchster, assuming that you become the new managing director and CEO of Jacksonville, I'd like to ask you to fast forward 5, 7, 10 years and reflect back on your tenure as CEO of JEA. What would a successful tenure be defined by in your mind?
Yeah, it's a good question, and part of it is those 5 themes that I talked about. I mean, I think I would want to make significant progress around those 5 big topics. But I think the litmus test would be kind of how customers felt about this journey that we're taking, how we were perceived nationally. I would want to see Jacksonville as a true leader within the community, recognized by the community as well as the state, as well as, the country in terms of the things that we are doing to create a new way of generating power and delivering power to our customers, and getting into segments that are, beyond the traditional utility space, like, mobility and transportation, EVs. I think there's just huge opportunities for us to provide energy, think about providing energy strategically across multiple dimensions. And to me, reflecting back of a successful CEO run is that we are able to accomplish that, and we're recognized for that.
Thank you. You've heard, and we talked about in the one-on-one interviews, the utility of tomorrow, or the 21st century utility. I wonder how, in the municipal context, you would balance the competing demands of a fast-changing technological environment and the need to also maintain fiscal discipline and risk management. How do you balance those in the municipal environment?
Yeah, I think that's another great question. I think the first step is to make sure that everyone's on board with change, that there's an embracement of change throughout the organization, that there's not, people are not sitting on the sidelines. They're heads in the game. They're wanting to be a part of this change. I think that's a big thing. Then I think creating a culture of innovation and thinking about things in less of a traditional way, but in a much more open way. So, the utility sector over the years, you had to be 10 years to be a plant director, or, 10 years to fulfill this job. There's sort of a line of progression. And those are still important because obviously there's important skill sets to be had there. But I think we also need to shake it up and put people with leadership attributes in different roles within the company, so that you can really try to sort of cross-pollinate ideas and innovation around an organization that's ready to change and make a difference. So I think it's a tough journey. At the same time, to your point, you have to have controls and fiscal responsibility in it. So those internal controls are critically important, but to me, it's not an either or. You have to have both. You have to have a culture of innovation and embracing change, and you have to have controls and fiscal responsibility.
Thank you. Reverend Newbill.
Good to see you again.
Likewise.
Was there any reason for the order of the 5 agenda items?
No, that's a good question. No, actually, number 5 was the most important. No, it's a good question. There's no priority there. I think all those are critically important.
Well, number 5, it was really what I was concerned
Right.
about. You said do it with the community. Jacksonville has over 30% minority community. And that 30% historically has been left behind. So how do you see JEA role as a key leader for the whole community, inclusive of the minority community?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it starts with engaging with that community. Don't isolate them. Don't leave them out of this whole process. Engage with that community. Some of the things that we've done in San Antonio, we've set up what's called a CREW, which is a community response unit, where we have teams that are out there in communities helping customers on their bills, on energy efficiency opportunities, on sometimes just helping them out. And so I think engaging with that segment in a very visible way, I think, is really, really important. I do think that there's opportunities to empower with the technology that we're talking about bringing online to go through this transformation, whether it's, running weatherization crews in neighborhoods to weatherize homes. That's good for those customers, but there's also jobs and skills that are applicable to folks that want those opportunities. So I think with energy efficiency, weatherization, solar installation, there's real opportunities to really engage that community to really create economic opportunity for them, as well as kind of broad education of where the utility business is going. So I guess the biggest thing I would say in response to that question is not to isolate, but really engage and have conversations with leaders in those communities to make sure that we have a partnership on what we're trying to do there.
Thank you.
Any follow-up? Yep. Ms. Green.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you likewise.
You have a wealth of experience in the industry. What would you say was your biggest accomplishment that shaped your career and prepared you for this opportunity?
I would say the whole CPS Energy story, that was truly a transformation along a number of different dimensions. It was a utility that was, again, 80% coal and nuclear with very little, technology innovation going on early on. Very well-run utility, a lot of history, great reliability, great affordability to the community, but was kind of missing the opportunity to really change. I mean, we were probably the last utility in Texas to bring a new coal plant online in 2010. So that was where the mindset was. And I was part of that senior leadership team that basically said, look, we're going to think about this thing differently. We're going to go through a transformation exercise here. And we did a lot of different things, but ultimately what we did was we got results. We went from 80% coal and nuclear to, much more balanced, where you got 25, 30% coming from solar and wind and energy efficiency and demand response. So we've created a digital grid where we've got meters and devices in our network that allow us to communicate with those meters and allow us to do functions that we haven't been able to do in the past. That was a huge effort, 5-year deployment. We came in under budget, on time, under budget with that project. So we've done some big things in terms of the clean energy space that I think are directly applicable to JEA and what y'all are trying to accomplish here.
Follow-up? Ms. Johnson?
Chris, thank you for your
Thank
time,
you.
and thank you for being flexible with me during our last interview. I appreciate it. You mentioned your big five, kind of your key pillars, and what you and I talked about a lot was really culture, right? Because getting a lot of those in place and going through ops excellence, working in the community as an asset, that's critical. Give me your general framework for how you would change a culture, shifting it to being innovative and embracing change. What would be your general framework?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Culture does take time to change, but once culture changes, it's powerful. It's like, you're changing the direction of a huge ship, so to speak. So I think that should be the objective, is to change the culture to kind of, innovation, customer service, customer engagement, community, some of the things we talked about. I think the way you get there is a lot of conversations. This is not a corporate program that, you're du jour, that you're just throwing out there. You're having a lot of town halls, you're having a lot of conversations, you're meeting with stakeholders in the community, and through those conversations, I think you start to kind of move things forward. Also getting the right leaders in place that also kind of get the program. So it's not just one person that's advocating, it's the entire team, it's the entire organization. And it doesn't mean it's just executive. It's throughout the ranks. You can have folks that are high influencers throughout the, in the labor force, in middle management, and just making sure some of those folks are really on board with where you're trying to go is the way I would approach that. But I think it still, takes a couple years to ultimately get where you want to go.
Thank you.
Mr. Campion?
Good afternoon. Chris, how are you, sir?
Thank you. Good.
Good. Couple of quick questions. We just had a conversation about culture. Would you say there's a deficiency in the culture at JEA at the moment?
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I think JEA, and again, I don't know it well, so I think part of, if this role happens, is I think there's a lot of learning on my part to listen, learn, talk to people, hear them, both again within JEA and outside of JEA, to understand really what's worked, what are some of the strengths and what are some of the challenges within JEA.
So more of a generic answer.
Well, I would surmise that, the culture is probably a lot like, CPS. It is a top-tier public power utility, well-run, good people, good intentions, want to do the right thing. I think get the perspective that there is that change going on, but I don't think really understand the breadth of that change and what needs to happen. So I think that's probably where a lot of emphasis has to happen, because that is scary for folks. I mean, that's a change in your job and what you do and how you get paid. So that I think that's the area I think the greatest opportunity is about change and their specific role in that change process.
Good. And a follow-up question.
Sir.
How committed are you to Jacksonville?
Well, I'm here.
Well, no, I've actually
yeah,
very specifically because Vice Chair Cumner said last time you were here, you spend a lot of time. And best I remember in a conversation, you were here 24 hours.
Yeah, so I would say, look, it'll be a big deal for me to move from San Antonio. It's, I'm not looking for a job. I'm here because I'm excited about what Jacksonville's got going, the potential to really be part of a transformational journey here, to lead that. That excites me. So to me, is the fit there on both sides. You know, we moved from Houston to San Antonio. We've moved over our course, so I'm not afraid of the moves, but I want to make sure that, you know, there's a great fit here. Y'all love me, I love you, you know, it's all that. I think that's really, really important. So I think if this process moves forward, I'd love to meet more stakeholders out there. I'd like to come back out and talk to more people and just kind of understand, you know, the fit here. But I'm committed, and I'm excited about this opportunity.
All right, thank you.
We've got a few more minutes. I have a follow-up question, Chris. We touched on the issue in our one-on-one of your sustainability experience. Specifically, you were the Chief Sustainability Officer for the City of Houston. We're hired at CPS as the Chief Sustainability Officer. At a high level, what do you see as the issues confronting the utility industry, both on the electric and water side, from the sustainability perspective, and how do we address those as a utility? Because obviously here in North Florida, water is a critical resource for us, and then there are implications based on fuel mix for the electric side.
Yeah, you know, it's a great question, and it's a complex question. It's easy to say we want to get to cleaner energy, lower emissions, but you know, there's some big global topics that are going on around climate change. And if you look at you know, some of the aspirations out there, they're talking about net zero carbon emissions, zero emissions for a city by 2040. And some folks, you guys think you got to be there by 2030. So there's just a lot of stuff that's going on out there. I believe that, you know, it is the role of the utility to chart a course there that is responsible, that is practical, that will get you there, that creates economic growth and prosperity for that community. And I believe that that path is available to us, but it's not an easy one, and it takes a community that's aligned on how you go down that path.
And I know you don't have specific experience on the water side, but just in your understanding of the industry, any comments on addressing sustainability from the water side?
So we partner closely with, we have a sister agency in San Antonio called SAWS, and they're municipally owned as well. So we partner and work very closely with them on water conservation issues. We are their largest customer. They are our largest customer, so we have a lot of sort of synergy there. But we've done a couple things. One is we basically use their reuse water coming out of their wastewater treatment plants to power our power plants, for the cooling lakes in our power plants. We also have a number of different energy efficiency conservation measures that we do with both water and energy together, promoting programs, going to customers and things like that. And we're looking to do more. I think there is a huge opportunity around the water energy nexus. And again, that's one of the things that excites me about JEA. You have both of those under one kind of governance structure, and you can do some pretty unique things to basically, you know, be more sustainable around both water and energy in a very unique way.
Thank you, Chris. I'll just go around the room one more time. Ms. Flanagan, follow up?
Just a follow-up to your response to Mr. Campion's question, in terms of your desire to come back to Jacksonville and see a little bit more of it. Would you be looking to make more trips to Jacksonville to inform your decision of whether or not you would accept the role, or are you prepared to accept the role today?
Am I prepared to accept the role today? I mean, I think there's a process that we need to kind of go through. I mean, I've not even, you know, we're not talking about compensation, contracts. So I think, to me, this is a very, very important milestone. And what I can commit to you is I'm here because I want to be here. I did not, you know, decide to kind of step out of this process. So if you all select me here today, I am very, very serious about moving forward on this opportunity. But I do need to. We got to go through some process to kind of see where we get to ultimate contract.
Mr. Cumber?
One follow-up to what we had talked about earlier about the community, and that board member Dubel followed up on a little bit. So, you know, one of the reasons we have a kind of a strong, I'll say, partnership with the mayoral administration and city council, we have a city council liaison, is a significant part of the annual budget for this city comes from contribution, franchise fees, other funds that flow through JEA to the city. This city's gonna continue to grow. You know, to me, there's multiple options, but, you know, one of the clearest is as JEA continues to find new areas of revenue, become more operationally efficient, is able to continue to be a growing partner with the city as it grows. I think everyone can agree that, you know, with the city's responsibilities will be, from a funding standpoint, will be more 10 years from now than it is today. Can you talk us through a little bit about how you would ensure that JEA and the city had a healthy partnership to make sure that it's not just a growth from our community from a job creation standpoint, but it's also being able to make sure that the city can provide the services it needs to its constituents?
Yeah, I think, again, a great question. I think there's huge opportunities to partner with the city in terms of, you know, thinking about, you know, the whole concept of a smart city, a more connected customer base, so that, you know, you can get on your mobile app and you can find out a variety of different things, whether it's energy related, mobility related, you know, quality of life, air sensors. One of the things we did in San Antonio is we put we have a TCEQ EPA requirement to do air quality sensors, you know, around certain spots in the city. I think we've got a handful of those. I challenge the team. I mean, with the sensor costs going where they are, why couldn't we put air quality sensors across our neighborhoods? And so if people are worried about their air quality, they can look at their block on their street. They can look at that. And we're a ways from getting there, but we can basically plug in that application into our smart grid. So we can basically use our platform that we invested to create a digital grid to add on new products and services that enhance the quality of life of people living in that city. So I think there is a big opportunity to partner with the city around you know, creating a city of the future that is more connected, that has a higher quality of life, and the utility, in my view, should be a leader, taking a leadership role in that process.
Can I ask one follow-up?
Please.
And hopefully this is a quick one, is I'm also trying to internalize your answer that you gave Board Member Flanagan. I think we walked on, I think all 7 of us walked in today with the goal of offering a job to a CEO that would stand up and say, I accept, and yes, there's contract details, yes, there's salary, but look, we're a public agency, so I assume you've looked up what we've paid our previous CEO, and so, you know, I can guarantee you, I don't think we're doubling that, you know, that amount. So, I think this would affect a lot of us. If we stood up today and said, we offer you the job, are you accepting it, or are you saying, I'll call you back in a week and let you know?
And it's the compensation is not, this is not about compensation. I just want to put that for the record. To me, you know, I want to be respectful of San Antonio, my board members there. I owe my community a conversation as to kind of, you know, my path here. And they're aware of it, but there's one thing from, you know, you're one of, you know, 3 or 4 candidates to you got an offer, you're going to take it, and you're going to move out, and we got to have a transition plan, and we got to think, you know, through those kind of things. So I would like to be able to have those conversations before making a final decision.
Okay. I appreciate the honesty.
Reverend Newbill?
Yeah. I know you probably read up some on consolidation of Jacksonville. Well, when Mayor Garbo was trying to put it together, one of the things the city did was made promises to Northwest Jacksonville, minority community. And a lot of those promises are the reason why it was voted yes. We have recently started dealing with one of the promises that was made in the 60s. So from the 60s to 2018 is a long time. It has to do with the septic tanks. And there are other issues, but septic tanks seem to have risen up to the top. So recently, the city promised 30 million, and after we sold land on the south side, Mr. Zahn committed 15 more million, which really is a drop in the bucket compared to the need in that area. So there was movement to try and keep a part of the promise that was made a long time ago. There are other promises the city made that haven't even been dealt with. So if you become CEO, I mean, are you willing to start to look at other areas that maybe the general community won't even accept as something that's our responsibility now? Even though the city had the responsibility and decided to make an independent authority, I still believe that independent authority still has responsibility of the commitment that the city made. So, you know, and I know it's, you can't tell me verbatim because a lot of information you don't have, but just what is your perspective on a situation like that?
I do believe, you know, promises, commitments are important to weigh in. I mean, you know, you're a public, you know, who made the promise and how it, you know, played out. I mean, obviously, you know, you got to understand that. But I think a big part of public power is you make a commitment, you want to honor it. So I think, in my view, is I think in those kind of situations, I'd need to learn about it. I think you put everything on the table. You have discussions about it. What's the right thing? What the right thing today may be different from what it was 5, 10 years ago when that initial promise was made. So I think, again, getting back to the question, I think those conversations are what's important, and really understanding where that community is trying to go, what could be most helpful, and how that ties to that original commitment, I think is important to have that discussion.
Without hookups, businesses aren't going to come to a certain area.
Right.
And so if we're looking at trying to build community, then there are certain issues that, and I guess I'm only asking you, would you be open to really listening to the community?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Ms. Green?
Thank you for your honesty to the question from Board Member Flanagan earlier. It is much appreciated. I'm glad that you kept your name in the hat, but was very honest with us when the question was asked. So understanding that you have to learn this community, as a municipal, we have to ensure that the relationships that we have with our mayor, our elected officials, the unions, and most importantly with our employees. Talk a little specific about how you would move forward with solidifying those partnerships.
Well, again, I think it starts with, you know, having dialogue, having conversation, listening, what's important to those stakeholders, what's important on their agenda, you know, try to find kind of a synergy around that. You know, I give you a good example. I mean, I've got very close relationship with our union leadership because they know if they can bring an issue up to me, I'll listen to them, and we're going to try to find a path. It may not always be the path that they're looking for, but we're going to try. We're not going to put it on a back burner. We're going to keep it on the front burner, and we're going to try to get a resolution. You know, so we're responding to their issues, and I think that kind of partnership where you're listening, you're trying to do something. Sometimes you can't always do exactly what they're asking, but you're at least trying, and you're trying to move the ball down the field, so to speak. I think is really important for folks, and when you can make a difference. So I'll give you a good example. We have. You know, I go out to the field a lot, and we'll have meetings with all our employees at a power plant, and we'll you know, talk. Sometimes we talk about kind of the strategy of where the company's going, and then we have a good dialogue. A lot of times, you know, they've got good questions, and the issues that they raise. Immediately after that meeting, I get together with my leadership group from that area, and I said, "This is what I heard. How are we going to follow up on this? Who's got this action item? Who's got this?" It could be as simple as, you know, whatever, the water fountain's not working properly, to some big issues like what does the workforce of the future look like, and how can I be a part of that? So I think being able to close that loop, I think, is really important in some of these more complicated issues, because you may not get from point A to point B straight. You may have to go a little bit over this way, but if you're talking about it and you're moving in the right direction, I think everyone gets engaged. People become disengaged if they feel like you're brushing them off, you're ignoring them, you're not respecting them. So I believe in the exact opposite of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Johnson?
Thank you. Chris, you certainly have extensive experience in the utility space, and your resume speaks to that. But as you can imagine, given a lot of what Vice Chair Cumber and Reverend Newbill spoke about, we've got some things on the horizon and sitting in the current marketplace that are going to require an individual to be a lot more of an innovator, someone that's got an entrepreneurial mindset. Talk to me about how you fit that description, that mold.
Yeah, I would say, look, I'm not a typical utility guy. I've been in the business now, coming on 10 years, but I've taken a very circuitous path to where I am here today. I got my PhD at MIT in electrical engineering. I was set to be a professor. I was going to be a professor and teach at universities and do research. And an opportunity came up to go to McKinsey, which is kind of more private sector. I wanted to kind of make that shift. I changed my whole path. I had to kind of figure out that whole private sector aspect and innovate around that. And so I spent 9 years at McKinsey as a partner there, very successful at that platform. I did an entrepreneurial stint there for 5 or 6 years there. I went to work for Bill White, the mayor of Houston, in the public sector after that. I went to CPS Energy. So I've proven myself capable of leading and being successful in a number of different environments. And part of my strength is I'm a collaborator, I'm a listener, but I'm also a problem solver. I like solving problems. I mean, that goes back to my engineering days. There's no problem I don't think I can solve, with the right information, with the right people engaged. So I innovate through thinking about solutions. If one of my team members comes and says, Chris, I got this issue. Yeah, you can raise an issue, but I want you to put a solution on the table as well. What are our options with that? So I'm really big on innovating around solutions that are good for the community and move the community forward.
Thank you.
Mr. Campton?
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
I'm the last, am I?
You are.
I sort of took it as an article of faith when we went into this process that the recruiter would bring a series of candidates to the table that would be capable of doing the job, and that was certainly the case. What I'm deeply concerned about across the board is the commitment to the community, the commitment to Jacksonville. And sorry to press on this. I just have a question that the last time you were in town, you were here for 24 hours. And then when pressed by several board members, you were sort of wait and see attitude. And again, I came into the process today with the understanding that whoever was offered the job would have discussed it with their family, would have discussed it with their employers, and would prepare to say, thank you, let's move forward. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. Sorry to be very direct about it. Some of the other candidates came and spent 3 and 4 days here. Brought their families, spent 3 or 4 days looking around Jacksonville, having a conversation. And the first time you did on video, the second time you're here for 24 hours. So my question is, are you 100% committed to taking this job if offered? But I can't know what the answer is simply because you need to check with third parties.
Look, this process has been pretty fast. I mean, from a couple months ago to where we stand here today in front of the Jacksonville community, it's been a pretty fast process. I am committed to this, this opportunity. It is a lot of things that I am very, very excited about. I'm excited about being in public power. I'm excited about taking the leadership role in a community that wants to transform and embrace change. So there is a lot of stuff that makes me very excited about this opportunity. And I wish I could just say yes if you guys decide to pick me here today. I don't think I need a long time, and I don't think it's, I'm also a guy that I'll show all my cards. There's a big part of me that wants to do this, that thinks this is the right time for me and for this community to kind of do something special here. I do need to have some conversations with, some of my folks in San Antonio, just to talk about that transition, if I do take it. So I don't think this is, I need to look at this for another 2-3 months. I think in the next couple weeks, I can come back and give you an affirmative.
All right, thank you again.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we went overtime. What's our count, Ms. Brooks? 44 minutes. So we will give the other candidates equal amount of time. We're going to take a couple of minutes just to make our initial, memorialize our initial thoughts as a board on our score sheets. We'll come back to our score sheets after visiting with all 3 candidates, but if you want to take a couple of minutes now. They didn't bring calculators.
Order numbers.
Give us a .5. Give us a .5.
Okay, a .5. All right, there you go. .5s. Always negotiating, Mr. Camp.
So John, 8 bottles of
We got to repeat
beer.
the last 44 minutes.
Yeah, exactly.
Lord help us.
I don't know what my son does with the beer.
Okay, let's resume. I've been advised that we are having some difficulties with our streaming. Apparently, we've got over 8,000 people trying to stream this meeting. So I apologize for those technical difficulties. I've been told the JEA team is working on it. This meeting is being recorded. It will be available later this evening or in the morning in its entirety. I am going to ask those persons seated at the table to please speak into the microphone, trying to ensure the best audio quality possible. And again, we apologize for those technical difficulties. With that, I'll invite Pamela Hill to the table. Ms. Hill, welcome. It's good to see you again.
It's great to see you.
So we're going to give
Thanks so very much,
we're going to give you 44 minutes, and please feel free to start with a brief introduction of yourself, your background, and why you're interested in this position.
Absolutely. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm just delighted to be here. My name is Pam Hill, and I've got 20-plus years of experience in the utility industry, and really in particular on the energy side, both the so-called competitive generation side as well as the regulated utility side. That experience really has been capstone with two particularly important positions that I think really relate to JEA. So one is the CFO of Jamaica Public Service Company. So Jamaica Public Service Company is a utility that serves 2.5 million folks, about 600,000 customers, revenue base somewhere around $700 million. Gosh, probably a good 85% of all of the megawatts of Kingston, Jamaica. That was my first experience, actually, in which I had a chance to work in a public/private sector integrated utility. So prior to that, I had worked strictly with private sector entities. Think Southern Company as an investor-owned utility, as well as Southern's competitive subsidiary, Mirant. But working at JPS really helped me to see a couple of things very clearly. One is the fundamental role when you are a public agency of the trust that the public puts in you, and the necessity not just to run the utility with the bottom line of the shareholders in mind, but with the bottom line of the community in mind, and to understand what that really is, to really feather out what is that value proposition that you're providing to them. Secondly is the increased requirement around compliance. When I worked at JPS, Jamaica Public Service Company, Sarbanes-Oxley was just making its debut. And it was making its debut courtesy a little company you all might remember called Enron. At the time, when I was working with JPS, I was with Mirant, which is an energy subsidiary that has now since been absorbed by NRG. Even though JPS was not required per se to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley as an international subsidiary, we made it our business to, I made it my business to as CFO, to essentially sign off on the same kinds of requirements had we been required to deliver those to our U.S. CFO. So that's one. A second capstone experience was in the Bahamas, so Bahamas Power and Light. There I served as CEO of that utility, and that is a publicly controlled, meaning government-owned, energy utility. That serves, gosh, probably 90%, I'd say, of the population of the Bahamas. So Bahamas is much smaller than Jamaica. However, it has some unique issues that are in some ways are similar to what we have here in Jacksonville. So one is that it is far-flung in terms of its service territory. So in the Bahamas, it's 16 islands that we had to serve. And a customer from the smallest island that might only have 20 to 30 meters was expecting the same level of service that we provided in Nassau. So one of the challenges that I had to learn to work through as a CEO of a company like that was twofold. One was to ensure that my FaceTime and my leadership team was really integrated through every corner of the utility, as opposed to just simply where it was most convenient or where we were headquartered. And I think if I were chosen as a CEO of JEA, one of the things I would surely want to do is ensure that our leadership team spends significant time in our meetings, not just here. This is an important location, no doubt, the central headquarters. But for folks that are in all areas of the field, you want to make sure that they too are understanding the vision and the message of where you're going. Outside of those two utilities, most of my experience has been split between two areas, competitive and regulated. Competitive, I think, is pretty important for a couple of reasons. One is that although JEA provides service to its customers through its territory, essentially through a franchise territory, the expectations, as they should be, of those business customers, of those residential customers, are that they have the same level of scope, of opportunity to ensure that their service is delivered conveniently and cost-effectively. And while working both at Constellation, which is the competitive side of Exelon, as well as at Mirant, which is the competitive side of Southern Company, I spent a lot of time leading teams where we had to compete toe-to-toe for business. This means in Georgia, for instance, one of my jobs was to make sure that we won not just as many megawatts as we could, but as profitably as we could against all of the munis, so the municipals for the state of Georgia, as well as the electric cooperatives. So that's brought a lot of lessons to me about how you deliver energy service to your customers and your business customers, even when you are in a franchise territory. On the Constellation front, a lot of the competition was around the products that we would provide. So think your average price or tariff that a customer can choose. In looking at the tariff book for JEA, it looks like that our residential customers have some scope. So they're able, for instance, to buy a portion, maybe even 100% of their energy through solar. Our business customers, they're able to make use of flexibility in terms of time of use rates. But there's a lot more that we can consider. Again, it has to be customized to what makes sense here, as opposed to just take everything off the shelf that Pam Hill has done and apply it. You customize it to what makes sense in the time and based on the characteristics of the customers. But there's a lot more in terms of types of products that we can offer. As far as 90-day, 6-month, 1-year plan, and thinking about how I would like to move JEA forward. So in my first 90 days, I would spend that time in some ways similarly to how I've spent my first, I'll call it 4 days so far in the Jacksonville area. So on my last visit, I was here, myself and my husband, 3 days. And then I came here on the early-ish side of yesterday afternoon, delighting in the rain with everybody else. And what I took that time to do was really just to drive around to the various districts, to understand both some of the highlights, the things that Jacksonville is justifiably proud about. I tried to get into the Ritz, but that was closed yesterday because I saw they had an interesting-looking museum, so I kind of peeked through the window just to see. I drove to Moncrief Village. It's not that far away. It's in District 8. I had already read about some of the great things that the councilwoman is doing there as far as her town hall meetings. And that was something that we did at JPS, Jamaica Public Service Company, as well. It's integral. It's crucial to always be there in the churches, at the hospitals, in the schools, at the community centers, meeting with your customers. I drove to District 5. and had a chance to see some of the great things that San Marco has to offer. And I actually saw a good bit of ponding, a lot of water that was kind of accumulated both in San Marco as well as along Moncrief Highway. So had a chance to think about how we would address that as we think about, I've heard the mention of smart city, and I've done some reading on that, and think about how we integrate water solutions into that smart city. So my first 90 days, as I said, would look somewhat like my first 3 to 4 days here in terms of really absorbing and listening to where we stand now. As was mentioned earlier by my colleague, it's critical to really make sure that you thoroughly engage with your employees as well as with all the other stakeholders. Some of the outcomes that I would want in those first 90 days would be to ensure that I am mano a mano, as it were, with where employees, with where the citizens of Jacksonville, with where the businesses of Jacksonville see our entity in terms of what it is that we are to deliver. Again, when you are a public sector agency, you have a sacred responsibility. It's not just to deliver on the financial outcomes, but to, in other words, not just to make yourself greater, it's to make your city greater. In my mind, when I think about the $116 million that we provide essentially as a dividend to the city, every $1 million is another, 30 or 40 teachers or 30 or 40 policemen. However it is that the city would use that. So those 90 days are really to ensure that I have a clear understanding of what our entity provides and what is needed. Second would be around the employees. I've already tried to get autographs from a couple of folks, from Aaron as well as from Melissa, because I feel like I know them firsthand after seeing them so often in watching the board meetings. And from what I can see, the employees are really outstanding. And I would want to ensure that I understand very concretely where they feel that they would like to develop, honest conversations around where there are gaps. I heard mentioned earlier about unions. For me, unions really only mean two things. One is food on the table, and the other is a roof over my head. Because both my parents were in a union. So in the case of my dad, it was the Transportation Union Association, essentially the subway conductor in New York. For my mom, with Eastern Airlines, right up until its dying breath. So when I take that with me, when I worked at Bahamas Power and Light, one of the first things I did was I sat down with the union leaders to understand what their issues were, where they wanted to go. A challenge that I heard, as an example, was we feel underutilized. Sometimes folks think, well, gee, a union person might simply be looking to just live by whatever the rules are in the book, and if the book says I can take a coffee break for 12 minutes, doggone it, it's going to be all 12 of those minutes. But what I heard from our union leadership and employees was that they wanted to be more engaged in driving forward the company, and they had a concrete example. We had a contractor who was responsible for running the generation for one of our largest plants. And honestly, we had used that contractor because when we had used our union employees in the past, we found that they didn't always show up on Christmas Day at 2 a.m. Or whatever would be the 24-hour, suddenly it's an emergency requirement. So we laid that out. Very honestly, to the union heads. They said they understood that was a different time in the company and that they wanted to be part of the new future that we were creating. So that's the kind of things that I would do in those first 90 days, make sure that I am aligned and that I am aligning others around where it is that we are going. In month 6, by the time now that we've gotten to month 6, it's time that we have a strong strategy. I know that Aaron, Zahn, Melissa, and others have already created a great framework based on what I've read and heard just in the public meetings that the board has, is that it comprises three main things, essentially, the strategy. One is making sure that operationally and in terms of the value proposition, the JEA knocks that out of the park, both on water and on the electric side. Second, we want to make sure as part of our strategy that we're environmental stewards. And that can mean things like watching our carbon emissions and making sure that they're within line, certainly our nitrogen on the water side, and even our generation mix in terms of more renewables. And third is making sure we're strong on the community front, making sure that we engage the business community, especially the small business community, the emerging business community, through JSEB and others. Those all sound like great planks to me, but I'm sure there's more to it. So using those 90 days where I've had a chance to engage with the stakeholders, by month 6, understand what additional meat is there on the bone, other aspects that need to be added, working with our councilmen and councilwomen to understand for their territory what is critical. And then by the time we're at month 12.
Ms. Hill, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap it up.
Okay, by the time we're at month 12, certainly ensuring that we now are at business line implementation and strategy implementation.
Thank you, I appreciate that. We're at 15 minutes, so 30 minutes left for questions roughly. Begin with Mr. Cumber.
Thank you. Pamela, great to see you again.
Great to see you, Deputy Chair Cumber.
I do want to talk a little bit about JPS and Bahamas Power and Light. And as I went back through my notes, I don't know if we ever touched on this, but as Board Member Campion said, we believe everybody who's in front of us is qualified for the job. But can you just summarize for us what led to the decision of leaving JPS and Bahamas Power and Light, so we just have a clear understanding of why those transitions had occurred in your career?
Absolutely. So in the case of JPS, I left as part of the company being restructured and sold. So by that I mean that at the time, JPS was owned by Mirant, or actually more pointedly, by Mirant's bondholders, because at that point Mirant was in Chapter 11 and looking to emerge, not simply looking to fold up its tent and no longer exist. As Mirant worked with its bondholders to negotiate an exit so that it could become a new company, which it became, called Zahn, Mirant sold off its international portfolio. At the time, Mirant owned, I believe it was 4 Caribbean utilities and ownership stake in the Philippines. So the 80% stake that Mirant owned was sold to, I believe, Marubeni. And as the new and revised version of Mirant moved on, I was offered and did have the opportunity to work in Atlanta. I'd started in Atlanta. But I knew that Mirant was on a new path, and it was time for me to also think about some new areas. So it was difficult, but that's what led me to move from JPS and the Mirant family to then the Exelon family. In the case of Bahamas Power and Light, so that was a contract that was essentially competitively won by a Southern Company, or really a Southern Company subsidiary. So the government of the Bahamas issued a management services agreement, which allowed for a company to come in and improve how BPL, Bahamas Power and Light, would be managed. As things can happen from time to time, when there is a change in government or sometimes another political motivator, perhaps, there can be a change in decision-making. And all along, the entire time that I was at BPL, I said over and over to the employees, and really to everyone in the community, this is your company. No different than JEA. It is your company. It belongs to every person in this room and outside of it. So I never faulted in any way the government of the Bahamas for making a decision that they thought would best suit them.
Okay, thank you. And then one follow-up. As you know, Hydrick and Struggles did kind of a workup on each one of you. My understanding is each one of you have seen your own assessment. Obviously, you did well, but I did want to hit on one area, which is, and you got great marks across the board. So, but operational excellence was the one area that Hydrick and Struggles kind of didn't rank you in the top category. I wanted to give you the opportunity to kind of respond to that and give the board confidence that from an operational standpoint, day to day, you feel comfortable walking into this organization and taking over on day one.
Absolutely. So my areas of operational expertise, I would say principally are in the finance area, also in the regulatory area, customer service, sales, creation of new products and expansion of existing products and business lines. On the generation, transmission, and distribution side, there I do not have an engineering-specific background. However, both as CEO of Bahamas Power and Light, as well as CFO of JPS, and really the many in-betweens in other positions, my responsibility, my obligation has been to more than just have a passing familiarity with those businesses. So as an example, I have led 3 hurricane restorations. One is in Jamaica, and that was Hurricane Ivan. Second was Hurricane Matthew, which was in the Bahamas. And then third was leading a team of some 200 folks on behalf of Florida Power and Light, and that was Hurricane Irma, also with Southern Company. For Hurricane Matthew, when you prepare for a hurricane, you're really working on 4 things. You're preparing in 4 ways. There's before the hurricane, during it, after it, and then on an ongoing basis, the continuity. So one of the things that we would do in our business planning, our capital investment and O&M planning, was to ensure that we looked at our spend, not just in terms of what the return on investment would be, and also not just in terms of how it would affect the community, but what would be our restoration time, what improvement would we have on the frequency of outages, on the duration of the outages. So that meant if equipment, let's say on the transmission and distribution side, we had long debated whether we should add auto reclosers to some of our circuits in some areas. And in some neighborhoods, we had made the decision that that was a lower priority. After the Bahamas had gone through an experience of Hurricane Joaquin, we had made the decision it made sense to fast track that. On the IT front, that's another area that I don't specifically have an academic background in, but certainly at a position at Constellation. One of my jobs during the integration, when Exelon and Constellation merged as one entity, was to find not just value and not just additional dollars of efficiency to squeeze out of the then roughly $100 million budget that we had, but also to find areas of process improvement. Again, in an area that on the IT front, in an area that I didn't have specific training in. So just to share a short story,
And we still have 6 other members. I
Okay,
just want to
sure.
make sure that
yep,
they have time to ask questions too.
okay,
so.
go right ahead.
Yeah, let
please.
me,
Anything else?
nope, I'm gonna,
So you've touched on this, but my question, Ms. Hill, was, in your experience at the various stops along your professional career, in addition to perhaps the storm preparation and far-flung service territories, what do you think in that course of experience has best prepared you for the role at JEA?
I think it's a couple of things. One is having had experience as a CEO and not just sort of passing experience or, gee, I think I'll just let the folks at the lower level iron out these issues and I'll just spend time in the community. But in-depth experience, really working through both operational issues, community issues, employee issues. So I think that's one area that really does prepare me. Two, I know that we are looking here at JEA for improvement in new areas of opportunities in terms of business lines. This is something, gosh, I've probably worked on 30 different projects at Exelon in every flavor of generation that you can think of, looking at how we expand our development there or make it more efficient. I've worked at Exelon, essentially developing the strategy and then helping to get the board approval for a new business line, totally new business line for us, which was an independent transmission company. At BPL, I led the development and execution of their solar strategy and getting the buy-in from the community, from the regulator. Some of that involves even charter changes and ensuring that happens. So I think those are areas where I'd be able to come in right away and add value.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Reverend Newbill.
Yes. We recently changed our executive structure. We were operating with a CEO and a CFO, but recently we moved from CEO to COO and then CFO. How would you see yourself working with that structure, or have you in the past worked with that structure?
So I would certainly see myself working very well with that structure, and I have worked with a similar structure. So at Bahamas Power and Light, we had a person who headed or had reporting to them the generation as well as the T&D operations. The CFO did not report to them, but as you can imagine, at every company, you structure the organization as much as you can based on what is optimal, but sometimes based on the people that you have in the chair. And so in that situation, we had someone who was ideally suited for generation, transmission, and distribution reporting into them, safety, environment, et cetera, but not as much on the finance front. I think here at JEA, I would likewise look at who is already reporting into the COO. I've had a chance, I already traded words with Melissa in terms of introducing myself. Seems exceptionally strong, and I would certainly look to really understand the structure as it exists, whether there are changes that are needed to make us even more optimal in what we deliver internally and externally.
Final question. When you say community partners, who all do you see in that structure?
Well, community partners, part of it is you really, again, look to who is already positioned as points of trust and as leadership points in a community. In Jacksonville, it appears that we are perhaps somewhat naturally divided in terms of geography, so both in terms of neighborhoods and in terms of districts. So to the extent that that's the case, then I would look to who heads those various districts to inform me. But looking at it purely from an outsider, I would say the community leads would be certainly your clergy, certainly your businesses, your large businesses. Certainly, those who are in a position of education and transformation, and chambers of commerce heads. So those would be areas that I would look to.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Green?
Good to see you again.
Great to see you, Board Member Green.
How long were you in the Bahamas serving in the capacity as the CEO?
Little over a year.
Were you there pre or post? I mean, obviously you were there during the recovery of the storm, but were you there prior to the storm?
Yes, I was, holding on to my chair just like all of us as it was roaring overhead, Category 4.
Okay, I was going to ask you specific about your disaster recovery experience. What were some of your biggest challenges, other than the fact that there was a lot of outages? And looking back, what would you do differently? What did you learn and you would do differently?
So some of our biggest challenges, one is that we had never had a hurricane of that magnitude in Nassau. And roughly 80% of the customers that we have are in Nassau, so that was a big deal. That was not just some small island, as it were, relative to where we served. Since we had not had a hurricane in Nassau, we did have a playbook. However, to be honest, some areas of those playbooks weren't as up to date once it came time to actually do the implementation. So as an example, when it was time to make sure that we were in communication with our city and our ministerial counterparts, there wasn't always a clear handoff in understanding that. Something that we came to realize very early on was the necessity to ensure that the board members daily, actually in the first few days of the storm, I'd say 2 to 3 times a day, knew what was going on, knew what was going on in their area, knew what was going on relative to their industry that we essentially had charged them with being the ambassador to, knew what was going on in terms of our recovery. I spent time, in the case of the Bahamas, it's members of parliament rather than city council members. So meeting with each member of parliament. They're really not too interested that, as an example, if the Bahamas is 80% restored, if their little area is not restored. So that meant meeting with them and discussing by circuit, where are we? By substation, where are we? Has any generator in your area, or backup generator, if that's what we were going to use, taken on water intrusion? So that's the sort of thing that we did. Something I learned that I would have done differently, and that we began to, but just not quick enough, our employees. So we certainly wanted to make sure that our employees were okay, but we really didn't do a good enough job at the front end. So for instance, we ordered a lot of materials, essentially ice shields and leak shields and tarp, that sort of thing that you would see when there's a big hole that's been torn in the roof. What we didn't do was actually poll all of those employees, especially those on the front line, to say, okay, we need to get an inventory of whose house took on damage, of how much money you need to make it through this, of the health and welfare of who you have in your household. We began to get on top of that maybe by day 6, but that's the sort of thing you really should be thinking about by day T-5. And that lesson has stuck with me, not just for what I would do for JEA, but likewise for all of the other businesses in our service territory that have to think of the same thing, that have to be ready immediately.
Thank you. In our last meeting, you had done a little research on our current obstacle with Plant Vogel.
Yes.
But you had a very interesting take on the recent downgrading that we received from the rating agency. Would you like to expand on that?
Sure, absolutely. So I had a chance to watch, as I've watched probably the last year to year and a half's worth of board meetings, the board discussion regarding Plant Vogel. And I agree very much with Chair Howard that in the summary that he gave at the end of the last board meeting, that JEA is extremely strong in terms of its its financials and is very much committed to ensuring that it lives up to its responsibilities. I think personally, regarding Moody's, that there is probably a lot more alignment rather than daylight in our positions. And so one of the first things that I would do is really meet not just with them, also with Fitch, also with S&P, but also with our bond investors. I'm imagining most of them are in the U.S., but to the extent that we have any in Europe or elsewhere, bringing them, making sure that they have a clear, concrete understanding of how strong we are today and how much stronger we will be tomorrow as we move forward with our strategy. And I do believe it is a matter for the courts to work through. And I would certainly, again, go through the detailed nuances of that, conferring with Brian as the CFO and others to ensure that we're all aligned on that message before we speak.
Thank you.
Ms. Johnson.
Thank you. Pam, thank you for your time. I appreciate you being
Good
part of this
afternoon, Board Member
process.
Johnson.
You and I spoke briefly about kind of a SWOT analysis of JEA when we had our conversation, but I certainly was intrigued by your perspective and would like the public to hear it as well. So I have a two-part question for you. Just kind of reiterate from your perspective the strengths of JEA, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, but also kind of take us through how you would capitalize on changing those strengths and threats in itself to maximize on the opportunity itself.
Absolutely. So as part of really getting to know both Jacksonville through driving around and walking around and even asking folks questions, when I last went home from our interview, the taxi who picked me up, he saw me standing in front of JEA. So he said, you know, I like the power and the reliability that I get from them, but I really don't, my bill, I don't understand my bill. It's not as clear as I would like. And it made me think about a conversation that we had, Board Member Johnson, where I mentioned that certainly an opportunity, I don't know if it's an outright threat, but an opportunity is to ensure that we're leveraging all the expertise that we have at the board, so that we make sure that our products, our services, and how they are communicated are done in a manner that really resonates with our customers. So as an example, in your industry, you would have experience and really be one of the few companies that can, within 30 seconds, enable a customer to quickly understand what is the product, how much is it, whether they like it, do they want to order it again, do they want to package it with additional value-added products. That is something that I would look to do as an example for the person who said, I really don't understand my bill. There's something that we can learn possibly from the fast food industry as in terms of an opportunity. A strength, certainly in looking at our dashboard, our scorecard, we're top decile when it comes to J.D. Power's and their recognition of us, as well as our customers' recognition of us on the business side. Wonderful. When it comes to a weakness, we're in the top half when it comes to our residential customers and what they think of us. So there's a real parsing out. This is one of the things actually I love about this process, not just this interview process, but JEA's Sunshine Law process, is that it allows us to take time in a public forum and really lay out and then engage the public afterwards on what we can do about that top half scoring. How do we do better? So that's an area that I see as a weakness for us that we really have to turn around.
Thank you for sharing that. Just one more question. Certainly you've seen the different articles and the like and the various media challenges that we're going through as an organization. And so certainly as you assess the various perspectives, you start to accumulate a strategy of if you were to come into this opportunity, how would you approach really strengthening the perception of the community about JEA?
Yep. So, as part of kind of doing research about Jacksonville, one of the things I learned is, guess who's going to be turning 200 soon? It's going to be Jacksonville. In the year 2022, that's going to be our 200th anniversary. And as it turns out, we as a city are also very focused on smart cities, smart districts. So something that I would engage in with the community, with the 19 council members, with our employees, with our business leaders, is how should we look not just for 2022, although obviously with that as a great focal point for us, but beyond. So certainly, I would look in areas that both are power and are water related. Our colleague who was interviewed earlier mentioned the need to ensure that there's integration between the two employee sets. Something that I saw at BPL was almost of a rural-urban split, is kind of how I see it in my mind. Rural meaning our employees on the so-called family islands, which are the smaller islands, every place except Nassau, in other words. And the urban meaning the employees in Nassau. And of course, the split being, Pam Hill, are you really providing enough attention in the way of resources, community engagement to the rural? I don't know if a similar split exists here in Jacksonville. I would imagine there could be in terms of disenfranchised and enfranchised neighborhoods, perhaps between our employees, between water employees. Gee, this is the smaller side of the business. This is only a third or so of the revenues, and our power side. But it's that level of not just lip service to integration, but to actually having water employees, for instance, not just know north side. You're now responsible for knowing the power angles of north side as well, because after all, the customer has to understand both sides, so we do now as well.
Thank you.
Mr. Campion.
Second to last. Thank you. Commend you on your research and commend you on getting into the details. And in the sort of spirit of transparency, excuse me, in the spirit of transparency and fairness, we asked Chris a question, which was, certainly difficult, but we respect his honesty. I'll ask you the same question. If this job is offered to you, are you prepared to accept it?
Yes, sir, Board Member Campion, I am.
Thank you. I appreciate that. One last question. You and I had a conversation. We talked about deploying technology, and we wrapped it up around the conversation of 2022. That's our 200th-year anniversary. And I would really appreciate if in sort of a couple of minutes you could describe what we talked about to the rest of the board members. I thought that was quite interesting.
Absolutely. So I think that two areas of focus are critical as we think about 2022 and how we engage the community. One area is ensuring that the technologies that we are seeing, I saw in one of our last board meetings that Aaron Zahn has been particularly instrumental in ensuring that we have an innovation focus at the company, and has done that by having our first ever innovation expo of sorts. That's something that I would build on. When I was at Exelon, as Chief of Staff to the CEO of Constellation, one of the things that I helped to do was to create a competition, as it were, of our employees and a partnership of our employees in working with the private sector so that they could think through how do we make use of existing technologies, of future technologies to help our business. One that was considered and actually gained a lot of support from our board was post-Fukushima having essentially a Roomba-type device that is able to travel into a contaminated area. It is controlled remotely, and that way you're able to see what improvements need to be made and where things stand. So that's one area that I would look at is really bringing additional technology partnerships with our employees. Then a second area I would look at is how do we add add that notion of innovation into our water sector. What are the opportunities there that we are missing? Again, in driving through the San Marco area as well as Moncrief Highway and noticing all the ponding, I just started to wonder, are there any sensors, for instance, that might already exist, apps that we might look at in terms of making our customers aware of potential hazards?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Ms. Flanagan, briefly, 1 moment.
Good afternoon, Board Member Flanagan.
It's great to see you again. Thank you for your time and
Likewise.
participation. You, in your description of your professional experience, you led with your role as CFO in Jamaica. And given that you've also served in the role of CEO, I'm curious if you can expand on any insights that you believe a CEO with financial experience and acumen lends itself to the role.
Absolutely. You are quite right. I did lead with CFOs. It turns out half my experience is on the finance side. However, as I think about how is it that you really begin to engage a workforce in terms of ensuring that they are delivering the highest level of quality in products and services, I think that all employees, to some degree, need to have a responsibility, certainly our leadership team, to ensure that they're thinking about things from a finance perspective. So as an example, when I was CEO at Bahamas Power and Light, we of course had a CFO, a very able CFO. The process had been that the CFO was responsible for putting together our capital and operating budget, not all by her lonesome, of course, with her staff. But the level of engagement, involvement, perhaps to some degree even full ownership by each of the senior leadership team members, I thought there was an opportunity to increase that. So in addition to having our senior leadership team own their budget, owning a budget means you come up with the underlying assumptions. You explain the variances. It's not up to the finance team to explain that. You're the one that needs to know why volume is different, or why margins are different, or don't just say, well, gee, it's because of the weather. What about on a weather normalized basis? What would the expectation have looked like? So it's that level of adding a financial lens that I expect and would provide to the operations and really to the leadership. Absolutely.
Thank you. Anyone else? Thank you, Ms. Hill. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much, Board.
Absolutely. Appreciate you
Thank
being
you.
here. Again, we'll take a couple of minutes for the board members to record their initial scores.
I don't think they know what that means. I think you say something.
Okay, one more time. If you'll take your seats, we'll resume. I'd like to welcome to the table our final candidate, the interim managing director and CEO, Mr. Aaron Zahn. Mr. Zahn.
Chairman, board members, first I want to thank you for the opportunity to work with you over the last 7 months. It has really been a true honor and a pleasure to collaborate with you, each of you on the transition of JEA from a government-centric mindset to a value and profitability-driven enterprise. It's amazing to me the progress that we've made in such a few short months. In March of this year, JEA was paralyzed by internal and external uncertainty. Candidly, at the time, sitting in your chair as a board member, I had a lot more questions than answers. I was unsure of the short and long-term strategy of the company. I was unsure of how we would collectively navigate and create a strategy with a highly fractured stakeholder group. I was unsure how JEA would mitigate a significant unbounded generation liability, which was Vogtle. Most important, I was actually unsure about how JEA would continue to provide the high quality, reliable, and affordable services to our customers while also dealing with the face of changing market landscape, while also meeting the financial commitments to our community. I desire to see JEA overcome all of these monumental obstacles and be an impact leader in this city, as well as in the entire industry. I want JEA to lead the infrastructure innovation movement into the 22nd century, not the 21st. A successful society is characterized by a rising living standard for its entire population. That means its entire population. And I want my hometown, the city where I'm going to raise my family, to be the paragon of such a society. This is the reason I stepped forward for the interim role as CEO, and it is the reason I humbly submitted myself as a candidate for the permanent CEO. The first challenge we faced together some months ago was a highly fractured stakeholder group. We worked together to build a consensus with the mayor, the city council, our community stakeholders, our union leaders, our management team, and most importantly, our employees. Because Jacksonville is the city of bridges, we actually reached out and built bridges as opposed to walls, which could have been easily done. Between May 1st and November 1st, I fulfilled a promise that I made on April 17th. That promise was to increase transparency and communication of JEA with all of our stakeholders. To that end, we redesigned the entire board agenda to create more transparency. I personally then went out and met and listened to and provided an open access for each of our city council members, having met with each of them one-on-one over 50 times in the last 6 months. I've met with over 1,000 of our employees, answering some tough questions, and believe me, they've had some. I met with the Civic Council, the pastors of the City of Jacksonville, JSEP members, the DuPont Fund, JEA's top customers on both electric and water, the Chamber, DIA, JTA, JaxPort, TPO, JaxUSA, individual community leaders that care deeply about their civic duty in the direction of our city, federal and state delegates that are concerned about our issues relative to Vogtle. I've also met with our commercial and financial partners to assess JEA's strengths as well as its weaknesses. Having obtained this data, I've come back to you, the board, each individually and collectively, and we've worked with the senior leadership team to create a foundation for JEA's future. As a unified front, we have pivoted JEA to a pervasive commitment of creating value and driving profitability. This commitment is embodied in the strategic framework which you all passed unanimously in August, outlining and providing clarity of measure for JEA's progress both internally and externally. If JEA's board and its leadership remain committed to driving customer value, financial value, community impact value, and environmental value, I feel confident that our community will be well served in time to come. By October 16th, 2018, 6 months later, after we committed to a transition, we accomplished a number of unique firsts. I mentioned the strategic framework. We've also created the guiding principles as a draft of a vision and a mission for going forward. We've initiated a unique telecom strategy around dark fiber to monetize hidden asset value on our balance sheet and drive a communication infrastructure for the city of Jacksonville forward to the 22nd century. We formally launched a corporate headquarters to drive downtown development, as well as our culture of JEA forward. We negotiated a 2-year extension of a contribution agreement with the city to create stability for 5 years. We awarded 250 megawatts of solar that will provide power to us, almost 5% of our demand, at a cost 20% lower than our current fuel rate. We have also doubled JEA's commitment of $15 million to the septic tank phase-out to drive, as well as created an innovative path for JEA to be a thought leader for the city on solving a $2.5 billion multi-decade-old problem of our community. We have provided the city water quality credits that are well in excess of $100 million in value. We have solidified and driven JEA's leadership in the state of Florida under water quality and water supply issues. In fact, we have become the first utility to, at scale, demonstrate wastewater to purified water at the Jacksonville Innovation Summit back in October. If you haven't tasted it already, I'll send you a bottle. We have partnered with the City Public Works Department, and most people don't know this. We have partnered with Jacksport, but in the Public Works Department, we have partnered to create a citywide organics recycling program that will not only provide recycling for organics, but also improve water quality. And last but not least, we've created a plan to de-risk JEA. Many of you have asked questions about Vogtle. We addressed that issue head-on, as a team, in unison, and with open eyes. We also put forth a plan in October to deleverage the balance sheet by an additional $1 billion over the next 4 years. It's interesting, a little fact, October 17th, 2018 marks the 125th anniversary of JEA's first electric plant. It is serendipitous that we spent 125 years dedicated to discussing the changing landscape in which our organization exists. Furthermore, as a community, we reaffirmed the enterprise's fundamental purpose and its role in Northeast Florida. Yes, Councilman Schellenberg, it is Northeast Florida. I appreciate you pointing that out because it's not just Duval County. We have 4 counties that we care for. However, one thing is for certain, and many of the prior candidates pointed this out, the era of our future is much different than the era of our past. In fact, little known fact, a couple years from now, our water business will actually be larger than our electric business. Not very oftentimes talked about in the public sphere. Few would argue the virtues of renewable, sustainable, resource-efficient infrastructure that is modular and easy to deploy. In fact, the empirical evidence is unequivocal. Over the last 4 years in the United States, over half the generation capacity installed was renewable and modular. In fact, additionally, it is also cheaper, oftentimes cheaper, safer, and more efficient to treat and recycle industrial wastewater on-site than to send it to municipal facilities. Still, some industry leaders, some public leaders, some policy leaders they question the inevitability of our infrastructure transition. It is often easier to stick with the status quo than to accept the integrated new approaches. The smartest players are now adapting, leading infrastructure innovation, seeing their customers as people or companies led by people who want infrastructure services that are reliable and more efficient. The solutions are oftentimes the most compelling and economic and provide the most consistent availability, and they will win whether they're the old technology or the new. I believe this board, the public, and the employees have learned that my character is one of focus, action, and fortitude. I also tend to view the life from a different prism. I also view business from a different prism. Our team at JEA is steep in utility and historical JEA experience. The senior leadership alone behind me has an average of 20 years of utility experience. In fact, they have 15 years of JEA experience. Not to mention, when I add the next 50 directors, that experience level rises to 1,000 cumulative years. It is true what people say about me. I do not have decades of traditional utility experience. Instead, what I bring to the table are decades of private equity, venture capital, hedge fund, telecom, water, distributed power, as well as customer-focused market experience, which I believe are going to be the experience set necessary for the JEA of the future. I also submit that that saying the CEO of JEA requires a lot of traditional utility experience pre-assumes that that CEO will not listen to the team. I submit that the next CEO should listen, collaborate, and be a leader in the community as well as in the organization. We should face tough questions together and deal with it head on, far more than being dictatorial. The senior leadership team behind me is one of the most skilled and knowledgeable teams I've had the pleasure of working with. Specifically, I think Melissa Dykes and Ryan Wanamaker will be unique talents to help guide this company forward for the years to come, regardless of your decision. And no matter your decision, I encourage you to take care of this talent and the rest of the team. JEA will have a highly qualified CEO. I have no doubt about that. Chris Euster is definitely a seasoned utility operator. Pamela Hill has a wealth of traditional utility experience. Regardless of the outcome, I can guarantee you this. The last 7 months, we've set the stage together for any of us to be successful. The progress JEA has made in gaining alignment in our community amongst the fractured stakeholder groups to set the strategic framework as a measuring stick for our progress going forward, as well as the recent accomplishments that I've just recently rattled off, and that's not all of them, will ensure that our company and our community will have a bright future. So, as you know, I am sitting here seeking your support to become the permanent CEO. And should the board provide me that honor, my plan would include the following. First, I will focus on JEA's culture. It is not to say it is bad culture or good culture. It is to say that we need to have an adaptive culture. We need an open culture that embraces ideas, it embraces change, and it accepts fast failures without blame. In this regard, this board has created great leadership in the way you have unanimously acted on Vogtle. Second, I will continue to drive alignment on a pervasive commitment to value and profitability. Managing the bottom line is the only way we will be able to determine the right course of the business. The strategic framework provides us a really good barometer for that. Third, I plan on implementing a technology and communications architecture that will support and accelerate customer choice. We can talk about electrification, we can talk about distributed generation, we can talk about all of the things that everyone puts on the front newspaper. Without the architecture to be able to control it, monetize it, and use it for our own purposes on avoided capital and peak shaving, it will be almost worthless from JEA's perspective other than driving it into the community. Fourth, under my leadership, JEA will continue to be very committed to de-risking for the benefit of our customers and our community. Two great starts are the STAR plan that was presented in October to this board of directors to deleverage the balance sheet by an additional $1 billion. The second has been our methodical, and yes, it has been very methodical, and one that we've worked on together, approach to dealing with Vogtle. First, and fifth, just as I have done over the last 7 months, I will begin in December collaboratively building a 10-year strategic plan that is executable and drives the value for the benefit of our city and our customers. In contrast to March, when I stepped forward as the interim CEO, today I'm happy to report that I sit here with far less uncertainty. It is not to say that everything is known. However, we now have alignment of major stakeholders. We have set a direction. We have a set of direction with basic measures. We have a plan for a path forward with Vogtle and for dealing with our risk on our balance sheet. We also have a team and a board that is focused on addressing market changes impacting our organization and our customers. And with that, I appreciate very much the opportunity to talk with you and look forward to answering all of your questions. And thank you again for the last 7 months.
Thank you, Mr. Zahn. I appreciate that summary of you and your team's accomplishments over the last 7 months. To some extent, you've had an advantage. You've been auditioning for this moment for 7 months. But in another sense, you've got a bit of a disadvantage because that does come with some baggage. My first question to you is, if selected as CEO, how do you overcome the suspicion and distrust that's been expressed by some members of our community that you were somehow a predetermined choice for this position?
Sure, it's actually a really good question. The council president, Anna Brachet, at the time when I was selected as an interim, asked me. And I said, you don't have to trust me. What I'll do is I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to do it. And then I'm going to come back and tell you that I did it. And after we repeat that over and over and over, eventually we'll start building trust together. We've laid forth a plan that was open from the beginning, and we started executing on it. We haven't deviated from it. We've tried to be transparent with the media, with this board, with our employees, In fact, we took listening tours with almost every stakeholder group in the community. The only way I know how to overcome trust issues is to talk.
Thank you. I'll yield to Reverend Newbill.
Yeah, we certainly appreciate the 15 million that was put in on top of the 30 million with the city. Can you give us some other examples of thought that you had regarding the community or communities that are disadvantaged? I mean, how can JEA, let me back up. In some communities that I know, JEA is turning on my light switch. And outside of that, and paying my bill, but outside of that, I don't see JEA as a leader in my community, as one of the leaders. What are some of the thought patterns that you may have had regarding building a stronger JEA as a leader, and that community becoming a real partner and feeling the partnership of JEA?
Sure. You know, I think the $15 million contribution to the traditional approach to septic tank phase out is really just the beginning. We actually have planned to launch an RFP that will evaluate the entire $2.5 billion problem holistically to look at commercial, technological, as well as other approaches to potentially make that problem something substantially less. And that goes back to just really even evaluating what are the basic parameters and assumptions being used to drive how were we going to fix the septic tank phase out issue. Perhaps we don't necessarily need to have centralized water and sewer that treats to high level disinfection, and because really an alternative to septic should be better than septic, it doesn't necessarily need to be at the highest end, which drives costs substantially higher. That being said, also on JSEP, you know, I've met with many of the pastors' communities. I think we can take a look at holistically, how does economic development is one of our strategic framework core values. And so, you know, one of the things that it's going to have to be a part of the strategic plan going forward is really opening up what are the right metrics that we drive, direct jobs, indirect jobs. How do we invest our capital both on the water and the electric side in order to create not only, you know, drive companies that are here, but also drive companies that are into Jacksonville. So for example, in the last 6 months, we've recalibrated how we're going to execute on our water plan by looking at more holistically bucketing programs to take advantage of specific larger companies, areas of expertise around treatment or pipes or other kind of elements. And what that does is also brings jobs to which would have otherwise been located elsewhere here. So I think there's a number of ways to look at it, and really it starts at the top with that kind of economic impact or community impact value remaining a core element that we need to drive as a business.
Thank you. I know we have at least 2 schools where JEA goes in and help train young people to either work in our industry or in that area of expertise. But the schools that we're in are schools that are set aside for those kids who are going to be successful anyway, okay? What are your thoughts on reaching out past those 2 schools to other schools where we can be more impactful on those students who are not in Stanton or one of the other schools? So
we definitely have a partnership program with Stanton as well as a number of the other kind of high schools around, and I think that can be expanded. One of the main risks facing us, not only on a water side, but also on the electric side, is our aging workforce. Trade labor will be critical, especially highly licensed in trade labor is going to be critical, recruiting that into our workforce and making sure that we drive that. There's no better way than to start that with kind of young apprenticeship and or mentorship type programs. JEA does a really good job of that already, but consolidating that and making it part of a community type driven focus, absolutely.
Thank you, Reverend Newbill. Ms. Green.
This was a question I wanted to ask you the last time we got together, and I think we got sidetracked. But as you sat as a board member, a previous board member, I believe you were in the position maybe 2 months. What did you observe as you were preparing to come onto the board? and you did your research, what did you observe to make you decide to pursue this opportunity?
So my experience and what I was working on is a platform around private equity and distributed infrastructure, generally speaking, which really lent itself to kind of acting as a board member. I'll just go back to my opening remarks. I was concerned about, for example, the basic organization structure. Much has been discussed about how we have a lot of stakeholders, and the CEO's job is to really align stakeholders so that and eliminate obstacles so that the team can execute. You know, a new paradigm is really calling the city council members some of our shareholder trustees. And I think prior to kind of, or as I was sitting on the board, what I was witnessing was a very misaligned stakeholder trustee board senior leadership relative to an executable plan for going forward. I think that's where the strategic framework really comes in significant value, because we now have, you know, those three major decision-making stakeholder groups in alignment on what matters and how to measure it. And without doing that, then you ultimately can find yourself doing a lot of activities and treading water. That's maybe an observation coming from a CEO that's actually had shareholders and had board members that you'd had to deal with, and and you understand that everybody has divergent views and perhaps isn't in the fire day in, day out with you executing on the business. And so that was a unique observation. The second was that JEA had a lot of really wonderful talent as well as kind of programs in place. But again, much to that alignment, they weren't all driving towards kind of one solid goal end. And so, you know, the initial, the first week, reorganizing the business to have Melissa in her seat and Ryan in her seat and Michael in his seat, really afforded the time for the CEO to spend with each one of you, with the 19 city council members, with the mayor, with the other stakeholders, to ensure that as we were developing a plan going forward, we weren't leaving anyone behind, and we were over-communicating. And so that was kind of, and then to the over-communication is really, when you look at our board agenda now as compared to historically, and it's not better or worse, but it's designed in 3 sections that really allow for this board to have complex conversations in open, transparently, without the public having fear of some specific action because of the way it's designed. And candidly, as we've talked about, and this board's deliberated numerous times in the last 7 months, as well as with the prior candidates that are applying for CEO, our market's changing. And so strategic conversations are going to be critical at the board level as we evaluate what the business is going to look like going forward. And designing a forum where that's non-threatening was going to be one of the things that we needed to make happen.
Thanks. In your opening statement, you made the comment that, whomever gets the job today, that the stage has been set. When you initially came on, there had been an assessment to evaluate rather the possibility of a potential sale. What has changed? That the stage has been set for success, but when you came on, there was let's evaluate to see if there's an opportunity for sale.
Sure. I said this, I believe, my first words out of my mouth at the first board meeting where we were debating the wrong question. We needed to determine what the strategic long-term vision of the business was going to look like before we could ever determine capitalization. That means that now you have a measure on how people determine how we measure the value, both because when you hold a stock as well as when you sell a stock, you're making a decision. And so we need to evaluate what this business can really generate for the community in customer value, financial value, economic impact or community impact, and environmental value. And I don't believe it's something that is unique, that only one of those 4 values is financial value. And that is a reflection of, the report we took from the subcommittee's work at City Council. They gave us guidance. This board put a lot of work into it. And what it spoke to was that JEA has substantially more different types of value to the community beyond just financial.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Ms. Johnson?
Sure, thank you. Aaron, I'm going to piggyback off of Chair Howard's question, really kind of addressing something that's no secret, certainly in the media and the like, of certain political figures and the public maybe having a perspective that you're not qualified for the role, and you've given us feedback about your experience. I've talked to you and asked the same question, but I'd like the public to really get a true understanding from yourself, your historical background and experience. How do you truly feel that makes you qualified for the CEO role?
Sure. It's really interesting. Over the last 6 months, not only have I spent time in the community, but I've also spent time talking to other industry leaders, specifically the other CEOs of large public power, which is 26 of the largest public power, CPS being one of them in the United States. APPA, Sue Kelly, the CEO of over 2,000 public power entities. And one interesting observation that's been made to me by a number of the different CEOs from around the United States is, in the 1970s and 80s, CEOs of utility companies were engineers because they were building. They were building a lot. And then it became the 80s and the 90s when legislation was being written. A lot of the CEOs migrated to attorneys so that they could navigate the pending regulations and be able to have an insight on that. And then as the 90s and 2000s moved along, they became finance-oriented professionals because finance was really critical relative to the changing capital market system. And one of the interesting things that Sue Kelly and John DeStasio, the CEO of LPBC, made mention of is that they're starting to see a migration of CEOs to customer-focused CEOs that have multi-market experience. My resume speaks for itself. I certainly have a wealth of experience in a number of different markets and have the ability, for those in the public, one of the things about being a private equity or hedge fund investor is the understanding of relative value. And I think the telecom strategy that we've established over the last 6 months is a very good way of thinking about that, because it's a matter of looking at it as do you want to build annual cash flow kind of incrementally over a period of time, or do you want to potentially look at monetizing the value of an asset for what might be a couple $100 million while also retaining ownership and or control for the benefit of the core business? I think also, much has been said about some of my ideas being to diversify JEA. I actually think that's the wrong way. I think we should consolidate and focus on our core businesses. Companies that tend to diversify away from their core business tend to actually miss opportunities and risks when they present themselves. So just the opposite, I would look at being stronger and being the dominant energy, supplier and energy product provider, as well as water supplier and water product supplier, and maybe potentially looking at less of a diversification to other areas that we just aren't, as a company, geared to handle.
Thank you. One more question. You spoke a lot previously to transparency, innovation, kind of that entrepreneurial mindset. With all of those types of characteristics comes credibility. How do you plan to build your credibility as a leader internally and externally?
I believe it's already started. On June 1st, we announced a listening tour and got out there and just started talking to each one of the employees face to face. And I think the first thing I tell them is, look, the door's closed. There's 30 or 40 of you in this room. You have the opportunity now to ask me any question you want to ask, and I will answer it in the most direct way possible. I can assure you they have. And some of them are uncomfortable. Some of them are direct aimed at myself because of that distrust. But at the end of the day, I look back and go, if we all agree on the strategic framework and the values we need to drive, if we all agree that our core values are safety, accountability, integrity, grow squared, ideas, and we all agree that's the company we want to drive, well then part of that is that people should be able to hold me accountable as much as I hold them accountable for performance. I've encouraged that of my team directly. It's been a unique experience for them to kind of do that for a CEO of JEA. But it's the way I think about leadership is sometimes you have to put yourself out there and go first. And that's where I've gone from.
Thank you.
Mr. Campion.
Thank you. A couple of quick questions. Plant Vogel, what does success look like?
Have the benefit of knowing a lot more than most people, so I'm going to be very careful in the way I answer that question. I would say, number one success criteria is that there is a resonating understanding from the entire market, both our peers and the capital markets, that JEA has never and will never repudiate its responsibilities to both its counterparties and its investors. Number two, I believe that success would be that our customers and our city receive the benefit of clean, renewable power upon the same construct of the deal that was discussed and agreed upon in 2008. I believe if I were to go any more into that, I might kind of divulge strategy and tactics, which I don't. Hopefully, board member Campion, you respect.
I was just looking to see how you're going to answer a difficult question. So that's the first question. Second question, not a lead into from the first question, but what do you perceive as the greatest risk for JEA looking out the next 5 years?
Adaptability, by far. It's not that change is a negative word. The reality is we do have, and we've published and talked about this at board meetings, that our distributed generation proliferation in our service territory is having a very real impact on net income to the tune of about $2.5 million in net income annually, and that's growing at a rate of 105% year over year and has been doing so for the last 5 years, a trend that has been going on but not really well talked about. And if we don't have approaches where we collaboratively accept that trend is not something we can just fight with policy, but actually that we need to identify a strategy and tactic both with tariffs as well as with perhaps corporate partnerships and embodiment of electrification and DER and potentially what I'd say IDER assets that we can control and manage the dispatch. We will effectively be fighting a tailwind that is or a headwind that's insurmountable, and we've watched it happen out west. We have the benefit of a decade of watching kind of all that play out, and I think there's ways where this team and this board can really define what the utility of the 22nd century looks like when it comes to distributed assets.
Good, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Campion. Ms. Flanagan.
Thank you, Aaron, for all of your continued efforts through the past 7 months. It's been a pleasure to get to know you. Candidly, I had concerns at the beginning in terms of how you were going to be able to rise to the occasion. Sure. Could you speak to your philosophy around management style, specifically with the senior leadership team and the learnings that you've had in the past 7 months that's gotten you to today?
Sure. The first one is extreme ownership. When something goes wrong, regardless of who actually did it, it's my fault. And not only owning it, but then identifying a solution and being prepared to address it. The second is listening. April 17th was relatively easy compared to April 18th. You had an entire senior team who had no idea who I was, no idea as to the rationale or to why I wanted the job. They had no idea as to whether there was a hidden agenda. And so it took quite a bit of time, and it was not easy to sit down and tell them, here's where I'm coming from. And I think you asked me, Chairman, point blank, how do you overcome trust issues? You sit down and you tell people in an adult way where you're coming from, the facts that you see, the data that you have, and you listen to them and determine whether or not they have competing facts or alternative views because everyone's walking around with a different perspective. And as opposed to trying to be a CEO that says this is the way it's going to be, and there's a new sheriff in town. I took the time to, and Pamela Hill had it spot on. You go listen to people. You understand their perspective. That is, the first order of being able to be able to determine kind of where they're coming from so that you can better articulate your position and then compare and contrast. And I think the teams oftentimes heard me say, I have one motto, which is, in conflict, there is no progress. In conflict resolution, there's a lot of progress. And so, that doesn't mean conflict resolution has to be painful, but it is one of those things where if you don't identify it and everything's always swimmingly, then maybe you're not pushing the envelope hard enough.
Mr. Cumber.
Thank you. Couple questions, because I know we're right on time. I want to maybe kind of end where Board Chair Howard started. And I feel like as a board, we kind of owe you an opportunity in an unfiltered way, where it seems like we probably, through this process, responding more through the media than directly to us. So, given the fact that, you mentioned your resume speaks for yourself, Hudrick and Struggles did these candidate reviews for all of us. You've obviously seen yours. And there are, several categories where at best you're tied with another candidate, and at worst you're third in that category amongst the other two candidates. So I want to give you the opportunity to really walk us through where when a third party kind of looked at each one of your resumes and backgrounds and interviewed you and ranked you the way they did, that you indeed are the right person for the job.
Sure. First, let me say that having been a CEO and a chairman and having been on multiple boards, I've actually ordered not only evaluations of myself, but also my senior team members. And normally they're done by industrial psychologists with a significant amount of experience with a one-day interview. So to have reached the conclusion they did in a 30 or 45-minute conversation while also reading my resume, I'm not sure how that occurred. That also being said, there's some actual factual misstatements in there. I've never been in investment banking or financial services. I've been in private equity and hedge funds, which is a buy side where you actually own the risk, not sell the risk. So as I started reading it, I'm not sure I took it more at face value as someone's subjective opinion based on kind of a very preliminary evaluation, as opposed to what I've seen of senior executives where they do a full in-depth analysis with one day of multiple interviews, psychologists and other things that I've put my candidly investor CEOs of portfolio companies as well as my own company through in the past. That being said, look, I openly admit I am not a traditional utility executive. So if the barometer is that, then is what this board is looking for relative to operating the utility going forward, then I'm probably not your guy. And I'm okay with that. But if what you want is kind of what you've seen over the last 7 months, which is taking difficult questions and dealing with the community in an open, transparent way, building bridges, despite what people say, we've always had good conversations, and we've always had the ability to work through, as I said, conflict resolution. So I can't put myself in the head of someone else. I don't even know who did that, candidly. So I just know that it was produced.
Okay. And then I feel like we also owe you the opportunity, and I asked Pamela the same question, to describe the circumstances that led to the decision to separate from BCR Environmental.
Yeah. So companies go through growth stages. When I joined, it was a pre-revenue business that had no EPA approvals nationwide. It had very little in the way of revenue, if not pre-revenue. It had one installation that was a pilot base. And when I left, it was 50-plus installations from around the world with 2 nationwide EPA approvals that had never been accomplished in the entire history of the EPA. It had attracted capital that was private equity and had grown to over $150 million in contracted backlog. So, when I look at it, that was a hyper-growth, call it what I'm going to say, venture stage business. And it had overcome what is normally known as market adoption, which if you're from the utility industry, unit 1 of a new technology is actually pretty easy. Unit 2, 3, 4, 5 are actually really hard because there's always an initial adapter. But once you're at unit 50, you become far more market standard. And so what we had looked at as a board and candidly as an investor group was migrating the business back towards more of an equipment sale and distributor model, which is a lot lower in OpEx and CapEx requirements in order to prepare the business for its next life cycle of growth, as opposed to what was the, call it solutions, long-term contract sale business. And candidly, as I started thinking about that in my talent base, I went to my majority shareholder and told them point blank that I probably wasn't the CEO for the next stage of growth. I think a CEO's job is to not only know their strengths, but know their weaknesses. And so we recruited a chief operating officer who's now the CEO. And we did so with the specific eye of making sure that talent was there for that next stage. And he is a phenomenal CEO for this next stage. And as I understand, it's doing very well. And then we recruited a chairman that was, a industry veteran from the engineering water services and had a global network of engineering relationships that was going to be necessary to grow the business to the next scale.
I have one follow-up, Aaron. Same question I asked Mr. Euster. If you are selected as the permanent MD and CEO, I'd ask you to fast forward 5, 7, 10 years and look back on your tenure here. How would you define success at JEA?
I would say that in the 4 areas of value, financial value, I believe we have the ability to double, if not more, the financial contribution to the city. I think that will take quite a bit of adaptation, as I'm going to very clearly point out. I believe we have the ability to continue to drive to be a leader in water quality and water supply issues in the state of Florida, which are a paramount issue that even though you look out the window, it's water everywhere. But we have seawater intrusion, we have seawater, rise, we have all of the issues that, David Bruderly came up and spoke about, and we're going to have to find a way to address those issues in the environmental value, whether it's driving the emissions per megawatt down or making sure that our nutrient discharge is lower than anyone else in the state, or truly driving towards water reuse for the purpose of sustainability. I think all of those need to be on the table. From a community impact and from a customer value, we're going to need to do that while also balancing rates, addressing what Reverend Newbrill talked about, which is bringing our entire population along. In my opening statement, I think one of the benefits of technology revolution that's going on is Moore's Law is coming to infrastructure. And so oftentimes we should be able to do more with less. And so many of the kind of, if you look back, the way historically infrastructure was built over the last 100 years, it was mega projects that were only available for those balance sheets that could afford it, sometimes public, sometimes private. Business models and modularity, especially solar, distributed generation, and battery, there is a third wave of business model where you can provide those types of assets as a service, low cost to people that wouldn't otherwise be able to afford the outlay of capital, and they just continue to operate their business or their home the way they have. Electric vehicles and autonomous, if you'd been to the Innovation Summit, you can see that ride sharing and electric vehicles with autonomous kind of driving are changing the paradigm on the way we think about cars and the fact that you may not ever have to buy a car anymore. And the neat thing is that JEA, with our telecommunication networks as well as with our energy, dominance, we have the ability to be at the nexus of that and drive it, and that should drive the cost of transporting people down at the same time as serving our community. So, long story short, I'd see Jacksonville as being the leader in both the energy and water space, while also significantly increasing our financial contribution to the city so that they can do more, as well as making sure that we're the steward of the environment that we have been for the last 125 years, and continue to set new bars as our water group has done over and over. I don't know if you know this, but our Buckman wastewater plant reduced nitrogen discharge to substantially below their permanent limits by making some innovative changes to the way they operate that facility. And, encouraging that level of culture where people are willing to take risks and then fail fast and adapt and say, well, that didn't work, as long as we're not taking outsized financial risks, I think is going to be critical.
Thank you. That would be successful. I appreciate your service the last 7 months and your continued interest in the position.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to take a couple of minutes and make our initial scores based on the presentation and question and answer from Mr. Zahn. Then we'll hear from Ms. Furman and have open board discussion on the candidates. I can ask you to take your seats.
Thank you.
So consistent with the process I outlined at the beginning for the meeting, we've had preliminary scoring. We're now going to hear from Heidrick & Struggles Representative Kay Furman regarding the reputational referencing that her firm conducted. And then I'll ask the candidates to excuse themselves, and the board can engage in open discussion regarding the candidates before we calculate our final scores. Ms. Furman,
Yes.
tell us about your reputational referencing on the three candidates, please. No particular order.
Right. So consistent with the process, it's the Heidrick & Struggles standard process to conduct referencing and to verify education for every candidate that is selected for a role. Most often, that is for the finalist candidate. That is the traditional approach. In this case, we were asked by the board to conduct that reputational referencing on the three finalists, originally the four finalists, which we did initiate over the past several weeks. Those reference requests are not always returned, so we reached out to a significant number of references, not those specifically provided by the candidates, those that are associated with a 360-degree view of the candidates' interactions and market reputation. So that outreach was initiated by us, and we completed a series of references for each of those candidates. The feedback on the references was focused on the priorities that were outlined in the specification, focused on the candidate's readiness for the role based on their skills, experiences, and demonstrated accomplishments, as well as their leadership style and attribute, what they're like to report to, what they are, what their boards of directors or the people to whom they report view them as leaders, as well as those who have them as leaders, and their peers, and oftentimes their stakeholders externally. So that was the nature of the outreach and the population that we connected with at varying degrees for each of the three distinguished leaders that are here as candidates. We found, in the case of the feedback, we found a lot of validation to the assessments that were completed in advance. The references validated a number of the points in the assessments that that you each reviewed and were able to validate in your own interviews with candidates. We found a lot of consistency there, and for each candidate there was a reflection of key strengths. You've seen and heard that from the candidates here today. We found the references for Chris Euster were extraordinarily positive around his deep operational experience, his industry credibility, his brand and reputation as a leader in this market, and his reputation for driving innovation in this market, particularly on the power side, less so on the water side, obviously. He hasn't previously been a CEO. He has led very large teams, over 2,000 employees for the largest municipal utility in the country, but he has not been a CEO. So he does not have that direct accountability in his background for the financial function, or in many ways the HR function, or a number of the other corporate functions that are associated with running an end-to-end business. His stakeholders viewed him very positively, his board and the community. So that validated in many ways the things you read in the assessment provided prior to your meetings with the candidate. For Pam Hill, I was just going in the order they met. For Pam Hill, it was validated through the references for a number of her previous peers as well as those to whom she reported and worked, particularly in the case of her CEO role, that her customer focus and community focus that she describes very articulately in her own presentation is very consistent with how she behaved in the community, and is very consistent with how she made it a point to make connections, and that combined with the unregulated activities really elevated her awareness around regulatory. So those things came through loud and clear in the referencing. I did spend quite a bit of time just because of the media coverage associated with the political situation in the Bahamas to validate that she was in a situation that virtually no one could have been successful in terms of trying to accomplish the results that the government had imposed on that particular outsourced partnered business contract, and the change in strategy by Southern put her in a situation where, you know, she gracefully and professionally managed through that. However, she hasn't led a business of this scale end to end from a full P&L perspective. She's got great depth in the regulatory and financial area, but less depth in the operations area. So strong partnership with an operating partner, an operating team, which you do have here at JEA, is an important contributor to her previous success and would be going forward. Relative to Aaron Zahn, his exit from BCR was such that there really was not an ability for the private equity sponsors to comment or provide specific feedback. So I was not able to get direct feedback.
I'm sorry, are you referring to a non-disclosure agreement in the separation?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, I am. And so I was not, they were not authorized or willing to provide specific feedback due to that non-disclosure and separation agreement. So I can tell you that the broader industry references and peer references that I've done have also validated that Aaron, much of what we've seen and he has demonstrated in his time here, that he is an extraordinarily bright, capable leader in solving complex problems, articulating and identifying and concentrating around that problem, and driving creative, critical thought to discern solutions. So that was validated without question in the references that were conducted. It was also observed that clearly this is a far bigger organization than he has previously been a part of or led directly. However, you as the board have had the front row seat to a trial run, and his accomplishments and demonstrated experiences in transitioning from that smaller company environment to a larger company have really been concentrated in this 7-month period. So as it's your assessment and direct experience associated with that transition that would serve the most beneficial in your evaluation on that point, just given the scale of the team and the operating nature of the business.
Thank you, Ms. Furman. Did you receive a negative reputational reference as to any of the candidates from the persons that you or your team spoke with?
I did not. I did not receive a reference that caused any concern that the way in the behavior, the integrity, the work ethic, the honesty, or the interest in the companies to which they serve for any of these 3 candidates.
Thank you. I'll open the floor for questions of Ms. Furman if anyone has any. Ms. Flanagan?
Kay, at the time of publishing, the report that we received for Mr. Zahn indicated that his degree from Yale had not been verified, whereas the other two candidates' education had been verified. Has that subsequently been rectified?
It has, yes. All of the education of all of the candidates has been verified per the education on the report.
Mr. Cumber?
Two questions for Kay and then a comment. And I don't know if there's a chance anymore, but I think some of us took advantage of it, but there were some good notes Kay had from these reference checks that we were allowed to review earlier today. And if we do end up breaking and there's an opportunity to, for those of you that didn't get a chance to scan them, I think it's worth taking a look at. I just wanted to give you an opportunity, Kay, because I asked Board Member Zahn about the assessment on him. Based on the reference check you did, do you stand by the candidate report that you had put together for him?
I do.
Actually, that's it. Thank you.
Reverend Newbill? Ms. Green?
No.
Ms. Johnson?
No, thank you.
Mr. Campton?
I'm fine, thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Furman. So I'll ask the candidates to be escorted to the 16th floor and allow the board to commence open and frank discussion of their respective qualifications before we do final scoring. So in response to a comment earlier from Mr. Campion regarding the objective nature of the scoring metrics, I'd like to proffer a suggestion for the board's consideration that deviates from the search process, or the process I outlined at the beginning of the meeting. We have 3 candidates. It seems to me that there is great value in the scoring, but that there's also some intangibles, and that perhaps it would be beneficial, and I just throw this out for discussion, to use our scoring to narrow to the top 2 candidates, and then that would allow for some further discussion between the top 2 vote getters that could take into account consideration of those intangible issues that came to light today. And of course, I'm speaking quite directly to the statements by Mr. Eutster, which completely took me by surprise.
Look,
Yeah, let's just have some open discussion. Mr. Campion?
Look, I had a call yesterday from Frankie McDermott.
Yeah.
And talk about being on point. And he reached out to me as he'd reached out to you, or you'd reached out to him, rather. And he'd reached out to me, notwithstanding the fact that we're both Irish, but he said he came out here with his wife, and they came out on the Friday. They were here Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and we had the interviews on the Tuesday. They put a lot of time and effort into it. And he went back convinced that he would, if offered, take the job. And then he had a meeting with his family. And this really, really struck me as, because I probably understood it probably more than a lot of people. He said what it came down to, himself and his wife looked at each other and said, we left a family in Ireland. We can't leave one in Sacramento. And he had put an enormous amount of thought into this, and he was deeply troubled by it. And his thought process was, if he wasn't prepared to take this job, he would take himself out of the process. And my issue, and I'll be very, very frank about this, and I have been from day one, I take it as an article of faith that the recruiter brought candidates that would do the job. I have an enormous amount of confidence in our chief operating officer and a chief financial officer. And I think that it's just critically important that the person who takes the job is vested in Jacksonville. That's sort of where I fall down hard.
I appreciate those comments. What do you think about my suggestion of tabulation down to 2, and then you are allowed to take into not the strict scoring
That's
for
fine.
the top candidate, but intangibles by discussion?
Absolutely.
So I'm sorry, so you're saying still score everybody?
And then you get to the top 2, and you can take into account the consideration. You don't think you need to?
No, I was almost like, I almost wanted to kind of flip it around, because what I was gonna say is, what I wanted to do was get a temperature, because if the board did not feel comfortable extending a job offer to one of the 3 individuals because they weren't willing to accept it today. Look, I want to also respect the fact that these 3 individuals have jobs today. They're going to have careers in the future. There's no reason for us to score somebody and, you know, and assess them if we have no intention of offering them the job. So if the view of the board was the candidate is not somebody that we're going to, you know, we're going to offer the job to today, I'd rather just have that frank discussion right now as a board and then decide what to do moving forward, as opposed to scoring and then saying, well, you know what, this is how we scored them, and let's talk about them, but we have no intention of offering them the job.
Valid point. Ms. Johnson, thoughts?
I'd rather, I think that that's a fair point if we're not going to offer a job to someone, but I do think that we should still go through the process of tallying those scores, getting an understanding of who really is third. I think we all have a true assessment, and I have a feeling that we're probably going to net out in the same area. But I think making sure that we've got a numerical assessment at least helps us kind of stay in a certain lane.
Ms. Green, thoughts on how to proceed?
I'm leaning towards agreeing with Board Member Cumber. I almost felt as though he was not committed to not only making a decision today, but if the job was offered, it was almost like it would be used as a leverage back home.
100%.
So I agree with Board Member Cumber that we, if collectively that we are not prepared to make an offer, then we should eliminate from the scoring.
Well, just point of order. You can't throw these out. So any scoring that's been done is a public record.
Okay.
Stop me if I'm wrong.
Well, we haven't turned them in yet.
Doesn't matter. You've recorded them in the course of business, I believe.
Preliminary scoring perspective, but are those scores being used to make the decision of the board? You know, that's.
I don't know, I would argue that until we submit them, like, I can still change my numbers on this page, so.
That's why we do pencils as far as
Exactly.
preliminary scoring.
I
versus
assumed.
Final scoring.
And we haven't done final scoring yet, have we?
And those numbers
No.
have not been used yet for any determination before the board, so I think you could modify them prior to submitting.
You have thoughts, Reverend Newbill?
Yeah, I think all of us were surprised that he wasn't actually ready. I was under the assumption that the ones that came in as finalists would all be ready to be off the job. And so it really kind of threw me way off. And it really doesn't make sense to me to offer a job to somebody who's not ready to take it.
Yeah, I don't know if, like, all of us remember this, but this happened at the port. The port offered the job to an individual who then went back to his hometown, and the hometown said, we'll make you port director. And then he came back to Jacksonville and said, I withdraw.
Yeah, the
And
Miami
it,
guy.
yeah, it created a little chaos.
Yeah, it happened here.
And look, I'll be blunt. I mean, I think Chris is great, exceptional background. I think he could step into this job and do an amazing job for this community. But if I was applying for this job, knowing all the steps we've gone through, I was taken aback that I would have shown up to this meeting knowing that if this board offered the job, I would be walking over and telling the board chair, I accept, and can we get together later today and start negotiating? I wouldn't have to fly home before I shook your hand.
Ms. Flanagan?
Could I just clarify with Ms. Brooks that procedurally the intent was that the highest numerical score would yield essentially an automatic motion in favor of that person, but that the board at that point then still has to deliberate and discuss as to whether or not that's a motion we wish to carry?
That would be correct. The chair would have entertained a motion to approve the highest scoring candidate. Discussion would ensue, and then whatever the outcome of that motion practice would have been was the procedural outcome. The idea is on the scoring sheets, if you eliminate one of the candidates and you determine you don't want to score them, I would just put non-applicable throughout the column on those sheets, because those numbers are not going to lend to your decision that's being made and being presented before this board.
I guess my opinion is that I think the framework that was established for today can still be followed through with. I believe that it has the appropriate safeguards to address any concerns that my fellow board members may have.
Okay, we've gone around the table. I'm not sure I heard a consensus.
Can I test out maybe a motion?
You can, sure.
I'll make a motion that our scoring sheet eliminates the first column.
I'll second.
I'm sorry, it would be the third column.
Mr. Euster's candidate.
Correct.
So I heard a couple of seconds, and Mr. Campion had the second. So the motion's been made and seconded that we eliminate Mr. Euster as the candidate. I'll open the floor for discussion. Mr. Cumber?
I think I said all I have to say before the motion.
Does anybody have any contrary thoughts about Mr. Euster?
What I will say is, I came in here very high on him, and that was a big blindside for me, unfortunately.
I haven't spoken yet, so let me weigh in. He was also very high on my scoring sheet, coming in and after the interviews. I think that I was also blindsided, very surprised by it. I would ask this question before we take a vote on the motion. If he's the highest score on all of our sheets, are we willing to live with the fact that the most qualified candidate doesn't get the offer?
I vehemently disagree with that.
Okay, I'm just asking.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm not vehemently
Yeah.
disagreeing with you. I'm just vehemently disagreeing with the notion. I think JEA is at a critical path and a critical juncture. We got a lot of issues in front of us, and I think that will be so disruptive to the organization. And I severely doubt that anybody, any other two candidates will hold their hand up if this doesn't work out and say, okay, I'll take the job now as second choice. I certainly wouldn't.
Well, by the way, that did happen with our last CEO.
Right, it did.
Mr. McElroy was the second choice. Not sure that changes your opinion.
Yeah, before my time. Look, I just think that I certainly think that my thought process is that certainly exceptionally qualified candidate, but I thought his commitment to the process the first time around it was a video. Second time around, he literally was in town less than 24 hours.
Can I just make one clarity, just because I was the search? The video was only done because he tried really hard to get here. There was a hurricane coming up through the Panhandle, and every flight that he was trying was canceled. So I just want to make sure that's clear.
And I would double underline that in font 72. If I was looking to become the chief executive officer of the JEA, which is susceptible to hurricanes and other national disasters, I'd have driven. I'd have been here. I would have shown my commitment.
Fair enough,
by
but I
having
just wanted to
gotten
make
here,
sure that
because
it wasn't a lie.
I think you can't dial it in when it's that important.
Right.
And then the second time round, I was very specific as I asked every candidate, what's your commitment to Jacksonville? How long have you been here? Have you been here before? Talk to me about what do you like in Jacksonville. And I was actually the person who talked to the recruiter, and I said, look, change hotels, here's where I'd like you to put the candidates, because I want to give them an overall view of Jacksonville. So the second time round, it was, came into town got in at 2 a.m., there was a problem with a flight, and then left within 24 hours. And yes, he was here with his wife, but the time amounted was very, very little. And I found all the questions here today, whilst they were intelligently answered, there was no facts, there was no details, there was no depth. And I think it was very perfunctory. And whereas a lot of the other candidates had done an enormous amount of research into Jacksonville and into the JEA, I quite frankly think I would agree with the council member to my left here, to my right rather, that if he got the job, it was going to be a leverage position. So that's my thoughts.
Look, we have 3 candidates. I think for optics, we owe it to the community to go forward with the process. I'm retracting what I said. I think that it's important. We were all taken aback by the fact that someone came into a final interview after a long process to say, I'm not looking for a job. So that is obvious. It's obvious to everyone here at the table as well as the public. I don't think it's going to make a difference whether we eliminate an individual or we go forward with the 3. I think it's apparent. So just so that we stay consistent to what we have set in place as a procedure, a process that we're going to follow, let's just follow that.
Reverend Newbill?
I'm confused.
Well, we've got a motion on the table to eliminate.
Yeah,
Motion on the table is to eliminate Mr. Euster and just, from the scoring. And just turn in scores for Ms. Hill and Mr. Zahn with the resulting vote between those two. To Ms. Green's point, she's like, look, we've got the ability to make a decision irrespective of the final scores, so adhere to the initial process. I think.
Exactly.
So, clear? That's
Yes, sir.
where we
I'm
are
clear.
procedurally. Any thoughts, additional thoughts?
No.
Ms. Flanagan, haven't heard from you on this. Oh, I did. You said that you thought the process accommodated it. Okay. So, any other comments, and we'll call for a vote on the motion to eliminate Mr. Euster from the scoring sheet. Okay, all in favor, and I'll just go around actually and take a voice vote. Ms. Flanagan?
I'm not in favor of the motion.
Okay.
Aye.
I'm a nay. I'm opposed to the motion.
I got it. I'm thinking.
Okay, sir. We'll come back to you. Ms.
Yeah,
Green?
come back to me.
Nay.
Nay.
I'm for.
4-2 and
I'm for it.
3. 4-3. The motion fails to carry. So we've got a scoring sheet in process, or in front of us now, with 3 columns to score each of the candidates, including one who may or may not be extended an offer. But I say that we take a moment. For those of you who use the pencil, feel free to use the eraser and do your scoring on a comparative basis. So let's do that.
Just one point of order, Mr. Chair, though. If Mr. Euster is the top scoring, then would the idea then be to have the discussion as to whether or not to eliminate him from the discussion and then go to the next highest score on the sheet?
I think the motion that we had contemplated would be to extend an offer to the highest score. The question is whether or not that's still the motion after the scores have been tabulated. But let's tabulate the scores and we'll see what the motion is.
Okay.
And just turn them into Ms. Brooks when you've completed them. Again, you did them following each interview. You're now given the opportunity to change your score based on the subsequent interviews. Previous.
Should we total our own?
I'm sorry?
Should we total our own?
No, we'll turn them in, then we'll talk.
If you're completed with them, we can go ahead and start inputting them into the table. I've got an Excel spreadsheet that's got formulas that's gonna automatically calculate. But just in case one of the formulas is a little off, I tested it yesterday, so hopefully the formulas are accurate, but I've got another person to verify the numbers, because I would not want there to be any kind of calculation error.
Or an input error.
Or input error, correct.
We can pass it.
So when
Should
you're-
have put your name on it, make sure your name's on it.
I think
You did.
getting sleepy.
you gonna catch your flight there, Hussein?
Pushed it back.
Or did you?
Oh,
To when?
7:15.
You sure you're gonna be out by then?
Good question. I don't know. Kelly's got the whip.
Yeah,
I could go to the airport at 4:30, so,
Oh, 4:30?
yeah.
You should have spoken up. I'm gonna delay my flight so much. He said we're here till 6.
Kelly, when's your flight? 4:50?
6.
6?
No, we're out here in 30 minutes, promise.
Were
you flying?
Back his flight out already.
I know.
Again?
Sorry.
You need to have a jet like John.
Yeah. Or a friend like John.
Yeah, friend like.
That's right.
Well, you got a boss. He's got one.
You gotta be going the same direction too.
True.
Excuse me.
Are these,
No, tabulating.
are these real? Are these needed? Or go away with me?
.5's that's slowing them down, I can tell.
7.5, yeah.
I confess I made use of it liberally.
You did, and I think in virtually every respect.
So did you say you have a place there? Stuff there, or you have to keep that?
Guess the whole number would have been easier, huh? Yes, consider the. I used the .5 just to be complicated.
I didn't. We could add it.
This category is supposed to just have one number, each of the categories. Do you want me to make it an 8.5, or do you want it a 9? This is on the experience in electric, water, natural gas for Miss Pamela.
Okay. Well, I went to town, didn't I?
As long as there's no hanging chads, we'll be fine.
Correct.
I was gonna say the same thing, I mean, we're not in Broward County.
That's okay.
We want to make sure it's right.
No pressure, Ms. Brooks.
Not at all.
And you're not gonna resign afterwards. If they come up with two different numbers, when they can get a third person over there.
Mr. Campion totaled his in my spreadsheet, same with his, which is.
I was just trying to be
Good sign.
helpful.
Thank you.
Always trying to one-up everybody, John.
No, I'm just trying to be helpful.
I'm sorry, I don't know this. Is Fulham going to escape relegation?
We won this week.
That's good. It's close though, right? We're third from the bottom.
It's pretty compactly. Really close.
I know you can get a great deal on chicken nuggets. How long is the pain going to last?
Believe it or not, the franchise community, although some of them are opposed by the franchisor, voted to continue rolling through into the new year. Yeah. So we're evaluating other brands,
Nuances of,
to say the least.
I don't know.
It's a constant panic. That's a short-term fix.
Yeah,
Right? I mean,
It's Band-Aid,
correct, correct. And so we've trained the consumer to
Right.
several different types of supply discounts. So that's the whole.
And then when your discount or that promotion runs, and your competition obviously will have the same difference. So they'll just transfer.
So, I mean, look, Berkeley's like that. They're not money friendly, but I did propose to my dad the other day, I think it's time to start looking at some different brands.
Diversification is one of that.
Correct. So, we're already in the Asian space, but,
What do you think about No, there's a franchise in town. Some of the kids who own it.
yes.
It's called Frame.
I've been there twice.
They've got one in Tampa Street.
Yeah, that's the one I've been
I know the kids who own it.
Okay.
They just really
That's
good
the
stuff.
standard, right? A relegation.
So, I've only been twice. And quite candidly,
Can't afford it.
I thought it was great. I remember they didn't take any risks, and that's what I carry.
So they've got one there, and then they've got another one down in the JTV, and where every fast food place is, in the JTV and Phillips.
Oh, yeah.
In there. Yeah, I'd say they're just good kids, and they seem
I think the concept is important. I don't think that they have the right growth strategy.
No, that's the point. That's why I'm saying you should talk to them. Maybe it's a partnership or something.
Yeah, no, I love to. Just because the key is, I think, is we have to keep transitioning, and a little bit of this because we have DoorDash. That if you're able to get the healthy food
Yeah, that's my job.
delivered,
Yeah, that's exactly it.
that's the vehicle.
Saturday. My wife's did a master's in nutrition. So that's
Are we waiting on Kay to validate?
She's gonna validate that the total number.
Have you been there?
Yes. I know. Yeah, yeah, it's good.
Oh, yeah.
Like real good.
Am I waiting
We
for
spent
it?
too much money.
Yeah, of course. That's why it's really good.
It's the old saying, like watching paint dry. She's all good?
What was the Oscars where they announced the wrong person?
Who was that did it out?
Yeah.
That was the wrong winner.
That's right.
Okay, we're back on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we've tabulated the scores from the scoring sheets, and for transparency, for public records and sunshine purposes, I'd like to read each of the scores for each of the board members. Mr. Chairman Howard, for Mr. Euster, you scored him at a 61.5. Mr. Cumber scored him at 64. Mr. Newbill, 53. Ms. Flanagan at 61, Ms. Green at 41, Mr. Campion at 50.5, and Ms. Johnson at 50, for a total combined score of 381 points. For Ms. Hill, for Pamela Hill, Mr. Howard scored Ms. Hill at 55.5. Mr. Cumber, of course, the names go off my sheet when I'm doing it this way. Kay, can you provide me your hard copy? The names of
Shrink
the,
it if you could still read it.
I know, that's the problem. My eyesight's not the greatest. No, I won't be able to do that. They're the same numbers. I apologize. For Ms. Hill, Chairman Howard scored her at 55.5, Reverend Newbill at 58, Mr. Cumber at 60, Ms. Flanagan at 59, Ms. Green at 38, Mr. Campion at 54, and Ms. Johnson at 56.5, for a total combined score of 381. So the first two candidates scored the 381. For Mr. Zahn, Mr. Howard scored at 60.5, Mr. Cumber at 64, Reverend Newbell at 66.5, Ms. Flanagan at 61, Ms. Green at 53, Mr. Campion at 56, and Ms. Johnson at 59.5, for a total combined score of 420.5.
Okay, so at this point, the chair will entertain a motion to extend an offer for the permanent MD CEO position.
So moved.
Well, you need to name the name, Reverend Newbell.
I move that we offer Mr. Aaron Zahn the permanent position of CEO of JEA.
Is there a second?
Second.
Ms. Green. Okay, it's been moved and seconded that Mr. Zahn be extended the permanent position. Open the floor for discussion.
So can I just throw out one thing?
Mr. Cumber.
Thank you. So I think we're, obviously with the scoring, it's clear. Just throw it out for thought. Is I think from the assessment and everything, we recognize that the operational side is not his strength. Leadership, vision, execution is. The only concern I have is, if tomorrow our COO position was vacant, it would be an issue for us. It is normal for, public companies that have a board that they do have involvement with, more than one principal executive officer at the company. And I do feel it's important that if we do offer it to Mr. Zahn, that this board still maintains, at least in the short term, it could always change its decision, that if that COO position opened up, that it would be a contract that would still be approved by the board, so the board had input on that individual. Because I think it's important to make sure that we have a strong operator at JEA. And not that I don't trust Mr. Zahn to have that strong operator, but I think from a fiduciary responsibility, I'd feel a lot more comfortable with the board retaining that.
Let me ask a question to our Chief Legal Officer, Ms. Brooks. Is there a charter prohibition on a board policy to establish board approval of a CEO contract?
There's nothing that would prohibit it. The only contracted employee that's listed in the charter is the CEO, managing director position. But there's not a prohibition that I'm aware of that would preclude you from having another employment contract with the COO position.
Well, I applaud the sentiment expressed by Mr. Cumber. I do think it's important that we address what we and Mr. Zahn have acknowledged to be his weakness, if you will, in making sure that we have a strong CEO. We're very fortunate to have an exceptional COO at the moment, but I would ask that we defer further consideration of that until we resolve the motion on the table. I do think it's a point well taken. Yes. Okay with that?
Could it not be a friendly amendment?
What would be the nature of the amendment, Mr. Cumber?
That we would offer the job of managing director and CEO to Mr. Zahn, and that the board would retain the ability to approve the COO position as well.
I would request that you make that a separate motion as opposed to an amendment on this issue. I'd rather keep this issue clean, limited to the CEO position.
I understand it, just,
I'll come back to you, I promise.
Okay.
Okay. As to the motion on the table, Ms. Flanagan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In tabulation of the qualities today, the only other thing that I wanted to raise for discussion with the board is that I found it a common theme and thread throughout today's discussions to be around community. And I found it difficult in terms of where to assess and place that on the grid. even if that had been a quality that we were ranking and including in this, I don't think that it would have changed the order of the candidates as I had ranked, but I wanted to acknowledge some of the sentiments that have been shared, I believe, by my fellow board members today, that it's extremely important that the person that we put into the CEO role of JEA has a commitment to Jacksonville. And I do believe that that's a quality that Mr. Zahn has demonstrated both today in his interview, as in addition to the 7 months that we have had to observe him.
Thank you, Ms. Flanagan. I appreciate revenue bill. Ms. Green, anything to add regarding Mr. Zahn?
I just echo the sentiment of Boardman Flanagan that community was the theme today, and that is important, as JEA is a huge asset in this community, and that Mr. Zahn is vested in this community, not only raising his family here, but he has gone above and beyond to demonstrate that in his 7 months while he was here.
Thank you. Ms. Johnson?
None for me.
Mr. Camp?
I think the process actually worked better than I thought it would. I don't mean to be disrespectful to the process or anything, but again, I voiced my concerns earlier today, and I would agree with Board Member Flanagan about Aaron's commitment to the community.
Well, I'll offer these thoughts in conclusion before we call for a vote. Not to steal Nate Monroe's headline, but I actually did not score Mr. Zahn the highest on my sheet. They'll be public record. I don't mind saying that I think Mr. Euster demonstrated in the categories we were asked to assess greater experience, something that Mr. Zahn himself acknowledged. However, I said at the last search committee meeting, and I'll say again today, that I have probably spent more time one-on-one with Mr. Zahn than any board member, and more so than perhaps anybody except the senior leadership team. He has consistently impressed me with his intellect, with his innovative thinking and approach to the problems and challenges that JEA faces. I believe he can be a very successful change agent. That word is overused sometimes, but I think it's appropriate in this context. As each of the candidates noted, we are entering a new environment as an energy service provider and water wastewater utility. We are not the utility of yesterday, and JEA requires someone that has skill sets that are perhaps different than those that were enjoyed by the leaders of JEA in the past. I do believe that he demonstrates those qualities of adaptability that will be essential to our success in the future. I am welcoming of his election and appointment as MD and CEO for JEA. So with that, I'll call a vote on Reverend Newbill's motion that Aaron Zahn be extended an offer to be the permanent MD CEO of JEA. All in favor, and I'll ask for a voice vote. Say aye, Ms. Flanagan.
Aye.
Mr. Cumber?
Aye.
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 It's unanimous. With that, the motion carries. The only other thing left on the agenda is the chair's report, and in deference to the time.
Can I make that motion that I
Oh,
would like to
yes, I
make?
said I'd come back to you, didn't I?
I knew you were gonna do that.
Trying to get everybody out of here, including you. Yes, Mr. Cumber, chair recognizes Mr. Cumber.
So I will put that motion on the table.
And you want to restate the motion?
Sure, for the board to retain approval of the COO hiring, the position of COO, the hiring of the position of COO.
Is there a second?
Second.
May I restate the motion?
You can.
That the
You're
board
the lawyer.
the board adopt a board policy to retain authority for contract with a chief operating officer of JEA. Acceptable?
Accepted.
So the motion's been made and seconded. Any discussion on that?
Not sure how I feel about that.
Reserving that power to the board instead of the CEO is the change.
I just think, I'd ask this question. If we had offered either the other two candidates or any of the rest of the candidates in the entire process the job, would we have tacked this onto the back end?
It's a great question. I don't think I would have made the motion because of the operational experience those individuals had.
And I would suggest that Aaron has, Mr. Zahn rather, has been interim CEO and interim MD for the last 7 months. And I think he has demonstrated the ability to do the job. And I think that certainly the board hasn't voiced any concerns. And certainly I don't think any of the other management have voiced concerns. I just think it creates a difficult situation. Having been a chief executive officer for a long time, I wouldn't accept that from a board. I would put it in a different way, but I wouldn't accept that from a board. So based on that, I'll have to...
Let me clarify, because you believe it unfairly circumscribes the authority of the CEO?
Correct.
So appoint as number 2 and negotiate with them?
Correct.
Okay.
Because in any...
Yeah, but to be clear, it's not that he doesn't get a chance to pick who the person is, doesn't get a chance to negotiate the contract. It's just that it has to come to the board for approval, just like he did with Melissa. Right? This board voted on Melissa's
right,
contract.
okay, so maybe I'm...
And so just like there are certain executive positions that you still have to go to the board and say, I have chosen X person. I have chosen X person to be in this position, but you go to the board and say, I need board approval to hire
Okay,
this
so
person.
it's board approval on the selected candidate.
Yeah, we're not going through, there's no COO search committee, there's none of that
Just fine.
stuff.
Well,
Yeah.
based on that clarification, then I'm fine with it.
Ms. Johnson, your thoughts?
So if that's already the case, then why do we need a motion?
It's not the case.
not
It was
the
a
case.
one,
So we
it was a
don't,
one-off.
we just have done that in the previous scenario.
It was done perhaps at your motion.
I think it
when-
was Ms. Flanagan's.
Or Ms. Flanagan's motion when Mr. Zahn became interim CEO. And again, the need was identified to ensure that JEA had the operational experience and talent in the executive suite
Okay.
It was not a contracted position at that time.
at that time. That's right. And the change now is that it would be subject to board approval, currently not board policy at JEA.
I'm still challenged with that as the position of the CEO and whether or not, to the previous point from Mr. Campion, Aaron has been in place for 7 months and understood and is learning aptly along the way the position and the operational experience. Totally understand. He's even documented himself that he has that deficiency, but and understood the motion previously to select the COO in that specific scenario. But if we're going to entrust the future of the company with an individual around innovation, transparency, forward-thinking strategy, et cetera, I would hope that we would feel comfortable in trusting his ability to select a operator, a chief operating officer for the organization. So I would say I'm not in favor of that.
Ms. Green?
You know, in most cases, in a CEO position, you would feel as though you're handicapping your CEO by your board determining your immediate hires, especially your executive team. But understanding the comment that board member Cumber made that he would not have placed this motion if it would have been one of the other candidates leads the community to believe that we are not 100% confident in Aaron Zahn on doing the job. I am 100% confident based on the 7 months that Aaron has demonstrated, operationally, financially, strategically, as well as innovation, that he's capable of doing the job, and I'm not in agreement.
Reverend
Am I
Neville?
correct that the motion was that the CEO would still pick
Correct.
his or her CFO?
So-
COO.
Correct. The motion is
And-
the contract be subject to approval of the board.
Right, then after the pick, then it would come to us,
Correct.
and we would either certify it or not.
That's the motion.
Correct.
Ms. Flanagan?
I have an understanding for where Mr. Cumber is coming from in terms of this being a control mechanism for the board to have adequate policies in place to ensure that long-term contracts long-term executive level employment agreements are subject to board approval. To me, if I was in support of this amendment, it would not be a reflection of my support for Aaron, but rather that I think it's appropriate if there are only two senior executive employment contracts that are not at-will positions, that before the company becomes encumbered with that long-term commitment, that the board have the opportunity to approve it.
Before I call for a vote, I'll weigh in and say that I'm not in support of the motion for reasons articulated by Ms. Green and Ms. Flanagan. I think that we should think beyond the immediate CEO and for the long term of the board. Is this something that we would handicap a CEO with in the future? I also believe that Aaron has demonstrated the competence to make his own hires. I think he recognizes the operational need to shore up his operational support with a strong COO. I actually took the liberty, and my support for him as CEO is informed by the fact that I took the liberty of speaking with several members of his senior leadership team, and with board members of VCR, and with other members of the community, and with a college classmate. So I really tried to do my due diligence on Mr. Zahn before today's vote, and I also have confidence in him, so I would not support this motion. Having said that, anyone else want to weigh in? And then let's call for a vote, a voice vote. Ms. Flanagan?
Nay.
Yes.
Cumber? Nay. Revenue bill? Yes.
Nay.
Nay.
Yes.
4-3. Okay, so the motion fails to carry. Is there any other business to come before the board? Okay, I'll waive my chair's report. We're stand adjourned. Thank everybody for their patience today, and thank you, board members.